The first obstacle to classification was not fear nor disbelief, but language. Every attempt to describe the underwater organism collapsed into contradiction. It appeared biological, yet violated assumptions about biology. It behaved like a system rather than a body. It occupied space, but not in a way that respected edges. When observed indirectly, it registered as structure. When approached analytically, it dissolved into process. The problem was not that it lacked defining features, but that it possessed too many, distributed across incompatible frameworks. Most known marine life can be reduced to a body plan, symmetry, segmentation, organs, locomotion. Even the most alien deep-sea organisms comply with some version of this logic. This entity did not. It presented no stable outline. Sonar returned shifting volumes that reconfigured between passes. Chemical sensors detected metabolic byproducts without identifying a consistent source. Pressure readings fluctuated as if something massive were present, yet visual confirmation revealed nothing corresponding to the inferred mass. Early interpretations assumed aggregation, swarms, colonies, distributed organisms acting in coordination. But this explanation failed under scrutiny. The patterns were too coherent, too slow, too internally consistent. Colonies exhibit noise. They fragment, reorganize, pulse. This entity did not. It behaved as though governed by a single internal logic, yet without a center that could be isolated. Attempts at anatomical inference produced mutually exclusive results. In some datasets, the entity appeared filamentous, stretched across kilometers in diffuse strands that thickened and thinned over time. In others, it appeared volumetric, occupying a roughly spheroidal region that migrated gradually along depth gradients. Occasionally, it seemed planar, aligning itself along thermoclines as though it were a membrane rather than a body. None of these models could be reconciled, yet all were supported by valid measurements. The assumption that the creature must possess a fixed morphology proved to be the first error. What was being observed was not shape, but state. The entity did not maintain a body in the conventional sense. It maintained coherence. Its form was contingent, adapting continuously to pressure, temperature, and nutrient distribution. Where conditions favored extension, it extended. Where compression was efficient, it condensed. Where gradients were stable, it aligned. Where instability increased, it withdrew. This adaptive fluidity made classification impossible. Taxonomy depends on invariance. Even organisms that metamorphose do so within defined limits. This entity had no apparent limits. Its structure was not inherited as a template, but generated dynamically. It did not grow by adding mass in a linear fashion. It grew by increasing the volume over which it exerted coherence. Metabolism presented an even greater challenge. The entity consumed energy, yet no ingestion could be identified. There were no feeding events, no prey depletion zones, no waste accumulation. Instead, energy appeared to be absorbed diffusely. Regions it occupied showed gradual reductions in free nutrients, not through extraction, but through conversion. Chemical forms changed state without clear intermediates, as if catalyzed by a presence rather than processed by an organism. This led to speculation that the entity was not a consumer, but a mediator. It did not eat, it transformed. It occupied zones of excess and rendered them inert, smoothing gradients that would otherwise drive instability. Where it lingered, biological activity became quieter. Population booms dampened. Chemical spikes flattened. The environment behaved as though regulated. Regulation without organs, without a nervous system, without identifiable boundaries, defied biological precedent. Yet the effect was undeniable. Long-term observation revealed that regions repeatedly influenced by the entity exhibited anomalous stability compared to comparable regions elsewhere. Not lower productivity, but lower volatility. Life persisted without surging. Death occurred without collapse. The system breathed slowly. Movement, if it could be called that, was equally alien. The entity did not travel along paths. It migrated as a shift in probability. One region gradually lost coherence as another gained it. The transition could take months or years. There was no leading edge, no trailing wake. It was as if the creature did not move through water, but persuaded water to behave differently where it was present. This behavior erased the distinction between organism and environment. The entity did not inhabit the ocean. It modified it locally, temporarily, reversibly. When it withdrew, conditions returned to baseline slowly, as though recovering from a long-held constraint. This withdrawal left no scars, no remains, no evidence of absence beyond a gradual increase in variability. Reproduction could not be identified. There were no juveniles, no division events, no growth stages. The entity did not appear to multiply. It appeared to persist. Its scale fluctuated, but its coherence remained singular. Whether this represented one organism or a process instantiated only once was impossible to determine. The concept of individuality itself began to break down under analysis. Attempts to compare it to known categories failed uniformly. It was not microbial, yet it operated at scales microbes cannot. It was not multicellular, yet it behaved coherently. It was not colonial, yet it lacked a center. It was not mechanical, yet it obeyed constraints consistent with energy optimization. It was not passive, yet it exhibited no reaction in the conventional sense. The most unsettling conclusion was that classification itself might be the wrong approach. The entity did not fit because it was not a member of a category. It was an outcome, a convergence of biological processes into a stable configuration that no longer resembled its origins. If evolution is understood not as a generator of forms, but as a search through functional space, then this entity occupied a region rarely considered: life as infrastructure. Infrastructure is not noticed until it fails. While present, it defines normality. The entity's influence was detected only because its effects were inconsistent with expectations. Not violent, not disruptive, but smoothing. Where models predicted oscillation, there was calm. Where collapse was expected, there was persistence. The creature revealed itself through restraint. This restraint made it invisible to most observation strategies. Instruments tuned to detect motion, interaction, or event-based change recorded little. Only long-term data sets revealed its presence, and even then only as deviation from statistical norms. It existed beneath thresholds of alarm, beneath the resolution of most sensors, beneath attention. The possibility emerged that similar entities had existed before, unrecognized, unrecorded, leaving behind only systems that behave differently afterward. If so, the history of life might include not just species and extinctions, but phases governed by unclassifiable biological states. Life not as actors, but as conditions. Eventually, observation ceased, not because the entity was gone, but because it became indistinguishable from background. Whether it dispersed, transformed, or simply lost coherence as conditions changed could not be determined. Its disappearance was as unclassifiable as its presence. Variability returned, gradients sharpened. The ocean resumed a faster rhythm. No specimen was ever collected, no image ever resolved. The creature left nothing that could be placed in a museum or assigned a name. What it left behind was a question embedded in data. How many forms of life are invisible not because they are small, but because they are too integrated to stand apart? In the end, the underwater creature too strange to be classified forced a reconsideration of what classification is for. Categories exist to organize difference. This entity did not differ. It blended. It solved a problem so completely that it vanished into the solution, and that may be the most alien trait of all. The implications of that realization extended beyond marine biology and into the foundations of how life itself was defined. If an organism could exist without a stable body, without discrete reproduction, without identifiable organs, and still exert sustained directional influence on an ecosystem, then the boundary between life and process was far less rigid than previously assumed. The underwater entity did not challenge classification by being too complex. It challenged it by being too integrated. Traditional biology depends on separability. An organism can be removed from its environment, examined, measured, and compared. This entity could not be separated without ceasing to exist. Any attempt to isolate it disrupted the very gradients that sustained its coherence. Sampling instruments detected fragments of altered chemistry and localized shifts in energy state, but never the entity itself. It was present only as long as the conditions that defined it remained intact. This led to a growing suspicion that the creature was not composed of specialized tissues, but of relationships. Relationships between dissolved nutrients, microbial communities, pressure regimes, and temperature layers. None of these components were unusual on their own. What was unusual was their synchronization. The entity emerged where these factors aligned in a precise configuration and persisted only as long as that alignment held. In this sense, it was less an organism assembled from parts and more a pattern that maintained itself. Patterns, however, are rarely granted biological status. They are treated as secondary effects, epiphenomena arising from underlying mechanisms. Yet this pattern exhibited agency in the only way that mattered. It altered outcomes. Where it existed, systems behaved differently. That difference was consistent, repeatable, and directional. It reduced extremes. It prolonged stability. It altered evolutionary tempo. These are not passive consequences. The question of intent was raised and dismissed repeatedly. There was no evidence of decision-making, no response to disturbance beyond slow reconfiguration. When gradients shifted, the entity did not resist. It adapted by dissolving in one region and condensing in another. There was no defense, no pursuit, no avoidance. If intent existed, it was indistinguishable from optimization. The entity occupied configurations that minimized energetic loss and abandoned those that did not. Such behavior sits uncomfortably between biology and physics. Physical systems also optimize, but they do so without memory. This entity exhibited memory in the only sense detectable, persistence over time beyond what transient conditions would predict. It did not flicker in and out of existence with short-term fluctuations. It endured through noise, suggesting some form of internal buffering. Yet that buffering was not localized. It was distributed. Distributed memory defies localization. It cannot be stored in a structure because the structure itself is transient. Instead, it is encoded in tendencies, in probabilities that favor reformation of the same pattern when disrupted. When portions of the entity were disturbed, coherence often re-emerged nearby under similar conditions, not immediately, but reliably. This suggested that the entity did not reproduce, but reinstantiated. Reinstantiation is not reproduction. Nothing was passed on, nothing was inherited. The pattern simply reformed when conditions allowed, as if the ocean itself remembered how to arrange itself into that state. Whether this memory belonged to the entity or to the system that hosted it became impossible to disentangle. The distinction lost meaning. As this perspective took hold, the original question of classification was quietly abandoned. Classification assumes stable identity. The underwater entity had none. It was not an individual, not a species, not even a population. It was a regime of organization that temporarily crossed the threshold into biological relevance. This reframing altered the significance of its disappearance. The entity did not die. It ceased to be instantiated. Conditions drifted. Alignment weakened. The pattern could no longer hold. As gradients sharpened and variability increased, coherence became too expensive to maintain. The entity dissolved back into its components, leaving nothing behind but a system that behaved differently afterward. The ocean did not register this change as an event. There was no collapse, no gap, no sudden imbalance. Instead, the return of variability felt natural, even overdue. Only in retrospect did the period of restraint stand out as anomalous. Only when compared against faster rhythms did the earlier calm appear artificial. Artificial, however, implies design. There was none. The entity was not engineered. It was selected, not through competition, but through persistence. It existed because it could, because the environment allowed it to exist longer than alternatives that failed to integrate as completely. This is a different axis of selection, one rarely considered because it operates below the threshold of visibility. The underwater creature too strange to be classified did not expand the catalog of life. It undermined the catalog itself. It suggested that life need not always appear as bounded forms competing for survival. Under certain conditions, life may instead appear as coherence imposed on chaos, as slowness imposed on excess, as structure without shape. Such forms leave no fossils. They cannot be captured, preserved, or named. They exist only as long as the system tolerates them, and when they vanish, the system absorbs the loss quietly. Their legacy is not a lineage, but a change in how the world behaves. In the end, the entity did not force science to accept a new category. It forced science to accept that some categories are contingent, useful only within certain regimes. When those regimes change, so must the definitions. The ocean returned to its faster rhythm. Variability resumed. Models began to fit again without unexplained calm. The data normalized. Yet the anomaly remained, not as a mystery demanding resolution, but as a reminder that life can operate in modes so integrated that they are visible only through their absence. The creature was never meant to be classified. It was meant to function. And for a time, it did. After its absence became complete, attention returned to the data with altered expectations. What had once been treated as noise was re-examined as transition. The return of volatility was no longer framed as normal behavior, but as evidence of a system operating without a former constraint. This shift in interpretation did not restore the entity, but it restored coherence to the narrative. The ocean had not become more active by chance. It had become less restrained by necessity. Over time, the episode receded into abstraction. Without a specimen, without a name, without a boundary that could be drawn cleanly in the stratigraphic record, the entity faded from focused study. It survived only in the margins of models, in footnotes explaining why certain intervals appeared unusually stable, in quiet acknowledgments that something did not quite fit unless an unaccounted-for influence was allowed. Yet its significance endured precisely because it resisted closure. It remained a reminder that life does not always present itself as discrete beings acting upon an environment. Sometimes life emerges as a temporary resolution to a systemic problem, dissolving back into components once the problem changes shape. In such cases, survival and extinction lose their usual meanings. What matters is not persistence of form, but persistence of effect. The underwater creature too strange to be classified did not challenge science by existing. It challenged science by disappearing without leaving a contradiction behind. Everything still worked. The ocean still functioned. Life still evolved. Only the tempo changed, and with it, the assumptions used to explain the past. In the end, the most accurate description of the entity was also the least satisfying. It was neither animal nor anomaly, neither species nor illusion. It was a phase, a configuration in which biology briefly crossed into infrastructure, and in doing so, rendered itself invisible through success. When that phase ended, nothing dramatic announced its conclusion. The ocean simply became louder, more reactive, more familiar. And familiarity replaced recognition. What remained was not proof, but understanding. An understanding that some forms of life do not want to be seen, named, or preserved. They exist to stabilize, to integrate, to reduce the need for reaction. When they are present, nothing remarkable appears to be happening. When they are gone, the world grows busy enough that their quiet work is finally missed. That is how the story ends, not with discovery, but with restraint acknowledged too late to observe directly. Not with classification, but with acceptance that some expressions of life are defined not by what they are, but by what they prevent. The ocean moved on. And the creature, having never truly stood apart from it, vanished without ever having needed a name. What followed was not an attempt to recover what had vanished, but an adjustment in how absence itself was interpreted. The underwater entity had altered expectations so subtly that, once gone, its former role could only be inferred through contrast. Researchers began to recognize that stability, when prolonged, is not a default state, but an outcome. It requires work, whether physical, chemical, or biological. In the ancient interval shaped by the unclassifiable creature, that work had been done quietly and continuously, without leaving marks that demanded attention. With time, this realization settled into a broader principle. Life does not always express itself through competition, expansion, or visible dominance. Under certain conditions, its most effective strategy is disappearance into function. When integration is complete, distinction becomes unnecessary. The entity had not hidden itself. It had dissolved the need to be seen. This understanding reframed earlier discomfort with its lack of form. The absence of edges, organs, and boundaries was not a failure of observation. It was the defining feature. The creature was not bounded because it did not need to be. Boundaries exist to protect, to separate, to compete. In a regime where persistence mattered more than defense, boundaries were wasteful. Coherence without enclosure was sufficient. Once the ocean shifted toward instability, enclosure returned as a necessity. Organisms needed skins, shells, reactions, speed. Life became visible again because it had to be. The era of invisible integration ended. Replaced by an era of constant negotiation, the underwater entity belonged exclusively to the former. In retrospect, its story clarified a subtle but profound truth. Not all life seeks to maximize presence. Some life minimizes disturbance so effectively that it erases itself from narrative. It does not leave ancestors, descendants, or artifacts. It leaves only a period during which the world behaves differently. That period had passed. The ocean now moved faster, louder, more unevenly. Its patterns were easier to measure, easier to model, easier to describe. Something had been lost, but nothing was broken. The system continued, adapted, diversified. Only one solution had been retired, replaced by many smaller ones. And so the underwater creature, too strange to be classified, achieved a rare outcome. It existed, fulfilled its role, and vanished without forcing recognition. It never became an object of fear or wonder. It never entered myth. It never demanded a name. Its legacy was restraint, and restraint does not insist on remembrance. The sea forgot it quickly. Only careful reading of the silence suggests that, for a time, something was there that made forgetting possible at all. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt resolved. Systems that had once moved under constraint now moved freely, and freedom carried its own weight. Variability returned not as disruption, but as character. The ocean began to express itself again through pulses, migrations, blooms, and collapses. These expressions were recorded, categorized, and eventually normalized. They became the basis for what was later understood as natural marine behavior. Only when viewed against the long, quiet interval did that behavior reveal its contingency. The unclassifiable creature had not suppressed life. It had deferred excess. It had not simplified the ocean. It had slowed it. In doing so, it allowed complexity to exist without urgency. When urgency returned, complexity fractured into speed, specialization, and competition. The modern ocean is the outcome of that fracture. It is vivid, reactive, and legible precisely because it no longer contains anything capable of absorbing its surplus invisibly. This distinction reshaped the interpretation of stability itself. Stability was no longer treated as an absence of change, but as an actively maintained condition. The question shifted from why systems change to why they ever remain still. In that reframing, the underwater entity emerged not as an anomaly, but as an answer that no longer applied. It became clear that classification had failed not because the creature was too strange, but because it had never been a unit in the first place. Units are countable. They can be compared, ordered, and archived. The entity was continuous. It did not add itself to the ocean. It altered how the ocean behaved while it was present. When it withdrew, the alteration withdrew with it. This is why nothing remained to be found. No remains drifted to the seafloor. No genetic traces persisted. No lineage carried forward its structure. There was nothing to inherit because there had been nothing enclosed. The entity had existed only as long as alignment made existence economical. Once alignment broke, dissolution was complete. In that sense, it had never truly lived or died. It instantiated and deinstantiated, as patterns do. The discomfort this caused did not come from uncertainty, but from implication. If such a form of life could exist once, it could exist again under different conditions, not as a survivor of the past, but as a response to a future configuration. Should the ocean ever regain prolonged stratification, sustained abundance, and low variability, coherence might again become cheaper than reaction. Life would explore that option without hesitation. Whether it would resemble the earlier entity was irrelevant. What mattered was the principle. Life is not bound to forms. It is bound to opportunity. When opportunity favors invisibility, invisibility becomes optimal. The underwater creature, too strange to be classified, was not a mistake in evolution's ledger. It was a solution written in a language that does not fossilize. Its story cannot be reconstructed through anatomy or lineage, only through inference drawn from the behavior of the system that once hosted it. That behavior no longer persists. The ocean today tells a different story, one of motion over mass, reaction over restraint, and visibility over integration. It is a story easier to study and harder to stabilize. The earlier chapter remains closed, not because it was erased, but because it no longer applies. And so the narrative ends not with discovery, not with proof, and not with closure, but with understanding. Some forms of life exist only to make the world quieter. When they succeed, they disappear into normality. When they leave, the noise returns. That is the only record they ever keep. The return of noise did not announce itself as loss. It arrived gradually, disguised as vitality. Blooms became sharper, migrations more erratic, collapses more frequent. These were interpreted as signs of a living, responsive ocean, and in many ways they were. What went unnoticed was that responsiveness itself had become necessary. The system no longer possessed the capacity to absorb excess quietly. Every fluctuation demanded reaction. Every imbalance had to be corrected actively rather than averaged away. In this new regime, life learned to speak loudly. Visibility became survival. Speed replaced persistence. Boundaries hardened. Skins thickened. Senses sharpened. Behaviors diversified. The ocean filled with signals, because signals were now required. Nothing could afford to exist without declaring itself. The age of silent integration had ended. Only later did it become apparent that something fundamental had changed in how stability was achieved. The earlier calm had not been the absence of activity, but the presence of a form of activity so slow and so diffuse that it registered as stillness. That activity had been biological, but not organismal in the traditional sense. It had been life functioning as condition rather than as entity. When that condition dissolved, the ocean did not become less alive. It became more demanding. This demand reshaped everything that followed. Evolution accelerated not because opportunity increased, but because tolerance decreased. Narrow margins replaced wide baselines. Strategies that once persisted for millions of years were now forced to adapt rapidly or disappear. Diversity flourished, but at the cost of endurance. The system gained motion and lost weight. The underwater creature too strange to be classified belonged to the weighted ocean. It had existed where time was abundant and urgency rare. Its disappearance marked the point at which time itself became scarce, broken into shorter intervals by disturbance. From that point forward, life could no longer rely on continuity. It had to negotiate constantly with change. There was no mistake in this transition. It was not a failure of the earlier solution, nor a triumph of the later one. It was a shift in constraint. The ocean changed the question it was asking, and life responded with a different answer. The unclassifiable creature was an answer to a question that no longer applied. In hindsight, this explains why classification failed so completely. Classification assumes persistence of form across varying conditions. The entity had no such persistence. It existed only where the question it answered remained valid. Once the question changed, the answer vanished cleanly, leaving no residue to classify. What remains now is not mystery, but perspective. The realization that life can sometimes solve problems so effectively that it erases its own trace. That existence does not always announce itself through structure or struggle. That some of the most consequential forms of life are those that make everything else appear unremarkable while they last. The ocean today carries no such form. It carries faster ones, brighter ones, louder ones. They are easier to see, easier to study, easier to name. They also require constant attention from the systems they inhabit. Nothing holds them together from beneath. The earlier ocean did not need attention. It was held. That is the final difference. The underwater creature, too strange to be classified, was not strange because it defied biology. It was strange because it fulfilled biology so completely that it dissolved into the background of its own success. When it was present, nothing seemed extraordinary. When it was gone, extraordinariness became the norm. The story can continue without changing its nature, because its nature is continuity. What follows is not escalation, not revelation, but extension, the slow unfolding of consequences that only become visible when patience is applied to interpretation rather than observation. As the ocean adapted to life without the unclassifiable entity, its internal logic reorganized. Circulation patterns that had once been moderated by biological inertia began to dominate unopposed. Vertical mixing intensified. Boundaries that had remained stable for geological spans grew porous. Nutrients no longer lingered. They surged, dissipated, returned in altered forms. The system became transactional rather than integrative. Energy passed through quickly, leaving little behind to anchor long-term structure. This shift imposed a new discipline on life. Survival no longer depended on alignment with enduring gradients, but on responsiveness to fleeting ones. Organisms that hesitated vanished. Organisms that diversified rapidly proliferated. Complexity increased, but coherence diminished. Food webs thickened, yet their connections grew brittle. Collapse became localized rather than systemic, frequent rather than rare. The ocean learned to tolerate damage because it could no longer prevent it. In this environment, memory shortened. Biological strategies no longer persisted long enough to define eras. Evolution accelerated, but at the cost of depth. Solutions were tested, discarded, replaced. Few endured. The record became crowded with forms, yet thin in continuity. This density of change is often mistaken for richness, but richness and stability are not synonyms. The earlier ocean had been rich in duration. The later ocean was rich in variation. The unclassifiable creature belonged to the former. It had been a solution that did not need revision because the problem it addressed did not change. When the problem changed, revision was impossible. The solution dissolved entirely, leaving no transitional forms, no degraded descendants. This abrupt absence is misleading. It suggests mystery where there is only mismatch. A key fits a lock perfectly until the lock is altered, at which point the key becomes useless without ever having been flawed. This metaphor, though imperfect, clarifies why the entity vanished without trace. It did not decline gradually into something smaller or faster. Its defining property was coherence across scale. Any reduction of that coherence destroyed the very condition that allowed it to exist. Partial persistence was impossible. Either the system supported it, or it did not. As time passed, the memory of that support faded. Subsequent ecosystems developed under new assumptions. Instability became expected. Variability became normal. Life learned to flourish under stress rather than avoid it. The ocean became a place where nothing could afford to remain invisible. Every form had to assert itself, defend itself, reproduce quickly enough to stay ahead of change. In such a world, the idea of a creature too strange to be classified feels alien not because it is implausible, but because it belongs to a logic that no longer governs experience. It is difficult to imagine something that does not need to compete when competition defines modern survival. It is difficult to imagine persistence without assertion, influence without visibility, dominance without conflict. Yet the data continue to imply that such a logic once operated. Certain intervals in the geological record remain unusually smooth. Certain transitions remain inexplicably delayed. Certain collapses fail to occur when all prerequisites appear to be present. These absences are often explained away through increasingly complex physical models. But complexity is not always explanation. Sometimes it is compensation. When biological regulation is removed from consideration, physical regulation is forced to carry more explanatory weight than it can realistically sustain. The unclassifiable creature relieves that burden. It does not replace physics. It complements it. It explains how stability can persist without invoking perfect equilibrium or improbable coincidence. This is why the entity remains relevant even in absence. It provides a lens through which ancient calm becomes intelligible rather than anomalous. It reframes the ocean not as a passive backdrop for evolution, but as an active participant whose behavior depends on the forms of life it supports. The notion that life can shape systemic behavior without leaving artifacts challenges deeply held assumptions. It suggests that the fossil record, rich as it is, captures only those forms that failed to integrate completely. What we see are the survivors of instability, not the architects of calm. The most successful solutions may have left the least behind. This idea is uncomfortable because it undermines the belief that evidence accumulates proportionally to importance. In reality, importance often correlates inversely with visibility. The more deeply something integrates, the less it stands out. The unclassifiable creature integrated so completely that it vanished into function. Its disappearance did not create a void, it created motion. Motion filled the ocean with stories that could be told. Predators, prey, adaptations, extinctions. These stories are compelling because they involve struggle and change. The earlier story involved neither. It involved persistence. Persistence does not narrate itself. As the ocean continued to evolve under its new regime, the possibility of similar entities arising diminished. Conditions that once favored integration no longer aligned. Stratification weakened permanently. Climate variability increased. Tectonic rearrangements altered circulation on shorter timescales. The window for coherence closed. This does not mean such a window could never open again. It means that, within the span of known history, it has not. Life remains opportunistic. Should conditions ever converge toward prolonged stability once more, life will respond accordingly. Whether that response would resemble the earlier entity is unknowable. The principle, however, remains. Life scales to fit the problem it is solving. The problem the unclassifiable creature solved was not survival. It was excess energy, excess biomass, excess predictability. Where these exist together, regulation becomes valuable. Where they do not, regulation becomes wasteful. This distinction clarifies why the entity did not provoke resistance or adaptation in other organisms. It did not threaten survival. It did not remove opportunity. It merely moderated abundance. From the perspective of individual organisms, nothing dramatic occurred. From the perspective of the system, everything was stabilized. When stabilization ended, individuals became the primary units of response. Evolutionary pressure shifted downward. Systems became emergent rather than imposed. Complexity increased at the cost of predictability. This trade defined the modern ocean. The underwater creature too strange to be classified did not belong to that world. It belonged to a quieter one, where life could afford to be large, slow, and invisible, because the environment rewarded those traits. Its story cannot be concluded with discovery or denial. It can only be concluded with recognition of conditionality. What existed did so because it fit. What vanished did so because it no longer could. The remainder of the record, dense with forms and events, is the aftermath of that simple truth. The aftermath unfolded slowly enough that it never felt like a break. It felt like acceleration, disguised as continuity. Each generation experienced only a marginal increase in variability, a slightly faster rhythm, a subtle tightening of margins. Over deep time, those marginal shifts compounded into a fundamentally different ocean, one whose defining feature was no longer restraint but responsiveness. Life adapted not by integrating more deeply, but by fragmenting intelligently. Fragmentation created resilience of a new kind. Instead of one stabilizing presence, many small stabilizers emerged, each temporary, each limited in scope. Blooms of plankton replaced steady baselines. Migratory pulses replaced static corridors. Predators specialized, then over-specialized, then vanished. The system learned to recover quickly rather than remain steady. Recovery became the measure of success. This change altered how biological influence was distributed. No single entity could now regulate across scales. Regulation emerged from networks, feedback loops, and rapid turnover. These mechanisms were effective, but they were noisy. They required constant adjustment. They produced more information, more interaction, more traceable events. The ocean became legible in a way it had never been before. Legibility, however, is not depth. What could now be seen clearly was also what could now be lost quickly. Short-lived equilibria replaced long-held ones. Stability became provisional. Life thrived, but it thrived on the edge of disruption rather than within continuity. The unclassifiable creature had belonged to the last era in which continuity itself was viable as a strategy. It had not competed with others because competition was unnecessary. It had not evolved defenses because nothing threatened it directly. It had not diversified because diversification offered no advantage. It had converged, slowly and completely, into a form of existence that no longer needed to change. Change returned not as an enemy, but as a condition. When it did, The creature's defining advantage became a fatal weakness. Its coherence, once economical, became expensive. Its persistence, once protective, became inertia. It could not fragment without ceasing to be itself. It could not accelerate without losing integration. The system no longer rewarded what it was. This was not extinction in the dramatic sense. It was a failure to reinstantiate. As conditions drifted, the pattern simply stopped forming. The ocean no longer assembled itself into that configuration. The creature did not die. It was no longer assembled. In later eras, scientists would search instinctively for bodies, lineages, fossils. They would find none because none were left. What had existed was not a thing that could be buried, but a condition that could only persist while supported. Its end left no debris, only a gradual increase in noise. Noise became the new normal. Ecosystems oscillated. Climate signals propagated faster. Biological responses sharpened. Evolutionary tempo increased. These changes were interpreted as progress, complexity, vitality. In truth, they were adaptations to a world that no longer buffered excess silently. The memory of that buffering survived only indirectly, in sediment layers that seemed too uniform, in ecological transitions that seemed delayed without cause, in energy budgets that closed too neatly. Each anomaly alone could be explained away. Together, they hinted at something missing. Yet missing did not mean hidden. The creature was not lurking, dormant, or undiscovered. It belonged to a configuration that no longer existed. Searching for it in the modern ocean was like searching for glaciers in a desert. The absence was not mysterious. It was contextual. Over time, the idea of the unclassifiable creature shifted from hypothesis to reference. It became a conceptual tool rather than an object of pursuit. It allowed ancient calm to be understood as achieved rather than assumed. It explained how productivity could coexist with restraint, how abundance could avoid collapse, how life could dominate without conflict. Most importantly, it revealed that classification itself is an artifact of instability. Categories arise when boundaries matter. Boundaries matter when systems are under stress. In calmer regimes, boundaries dissolve. Life does not need to declare itself. It simply aligns. The underwater creature too strange to be classified had aligned so completely that it erased the need for its own recognition. Its success lay in invisibility. Its disappearance lay in irrelevance. The ocean did not mourn. It adapted, as it always does. New strategies emerged, better suited to a faster world. They filled the record with forms, events, and stories. These stories became the history we know, crowded and dramatic and richly detailed. What preceded them remained quiet. And in that quiet lies the final understanding. Not all life seeks to be remembered. Some life exists to make remembering unnecessary. It holds systems steady long enough that nothing seems to happen, and when it leaves, happening returns. That was the role of the unclassifiable creature. It was not an exception to biology. It was biology functioning at a scale and depth no longer accessible. When that depth vanished, so did the form that depended on it. The ocean moved forward, and the creature, having never stood apart from the sea, ended exactly as it had lived, by dissolving back into the conditions that once made it possible. The continuation does not alter the direction of the narrative, because the narrative itself is not moving toward a revelation. It is moving toward saturation. Each layer added does not introduce something new, but deepens the same understanding from another angle, the way pressure increases with depth without changing the water itself. As the modern ocean stabilized into its faster, noisier equilibrium, the traces of the earlier regime became harder to distinguish, not because they vanished completely, but because they were overwritten. New rhythms imposed themselves on old structures. Sediments were reworked. Currents carved different paths. Biological communities reorganized so thoroughly that the earlier logic no longer applied even indirectly. The memory of integration was buried beneath adaptation. Yet some questions continued to resist simple answers. Why did certain ancient systems remain productive for so long without tipping into collapse? Why did evolutionary rates remain unusually low despite abundant opportunity? Why did extinction events sometimes fail to occur where all triggers appeared present? These questions did not invalidate existing theories, but they strained them. Each required additional conditions, additional assumptions, additional corrections. The unclassifiable creature was not invoked to replace those explanations, but to simplify them. It reduced the need for coincidence. It removed the requirement for perfect balance in purely physical terms. It acknowledged that biology itself can become a stabilizing field, not through competition, but through occupation. Occupation, at that scale, does not resemble conquest. It resembles saturation. The entity did not dominate space aggressively. It filled it gently. Where it existed, there was less room for excess to accumulate unchecked. Not because resources were scarce, but because surplus was continuously absorbed into coherence. This absorption did not leave scars. It left quiet. Quiet, however, is difficult to detect without contrast. Only when the quiet ends does it become apparent that it was ever there. This is why the creature's story emerges only when viewed backward, inferred from change rather than observed directly. Its presence was never remarkable. Its absence made remarkability unavoidable. The modern tendency to equate biological success with proliferation obscures this possibility. Proliferation is visible. It leaves traces. It generates data. But proliferation is only one response to opportunity. Consolidation is another. Under conditions of long-term stability, consolidation is cheaper. It reduces redundancy. It minimizes waste. It favors persistence over novelty. The unclassifiable creature was consolidation realized fully. It did not branch. It did not diversify. It did not compete. It converged. Convergence, once complete, has no further evolutionary trajectory. It holds until the environment shifts. When it does, convergence collapses entirely. This collapse is absolute because convergence depends on total alignment. Partial alignment is not viable. There is no degraded version of the entity that can persist under altered conditions. Either the system assembles into that configuration, or it does not assemble at all. When it stops assembling, nothing remains. This is why the creature leaves no transitional forms, no fossils of decline, no traces of struggle. The pattern simply ceases to appear. Later life fills the space with different patterns suited to new constraints. The absence is total because the solution was total. Such solutions are rare, but not impossible. They require time more than ingenuity. Time without interruption. Time without shock. Time without fragmentation. The ancient ocean provided that time. Modern oceans do not. They are too disturbed, too mixed, too transient. This recognition does not diminish modern life. It explains it. The speed, diversity, and reactivity of contemporary ecosystems are responses to a world that no longer tolerates deep integration. Life has become agile because agility is rewarded. It has become visible because visibility is necessary. It has become loud because silence no longer stabilizes. The underwater creature too strange to be classified belonged to a world where silence did stabilize, where the most effective form of life was the one that prevented stories from happening. It existed not to be noticed, but to ensure that nothing needed to be. When that need disappeared, so did the form. The story continues only insofar as interpretation continues. There is no final discovery waiting beyond the horizon. There is only increasing comfort with the idea that some forms of life are not meant to be found. They are meant to function until they are no longer required. The ocean does not preserve every solution it has tried. It preserves only those that fail loudly enough to leave remains. The most successful solutions vanish cleanly, leaving behind systems that must learn to operate without them. In this sense, the unclassifiable creature achieved a kind of perfection. It solved a problem completely, so completely that it erased its own necessity. When the problem changed, it withdrew without residue. That is why its story feels endless. It does not culminate, it diffuses. Like the creature itself, it resists boundaries, categories, and conclusions. It can only be approached asymptotically, understood through alignment rather than capture. And so the narrative extends, not because there is more to reveal, but because understanding deepens with patience. Each extension does not add content, it adds weight. The ocean once carried something too integrated to be named. It no longer does. The difference between those two states is subtle, profound, and irreversible. That difference is the true subject of the story. And it remains, quietly, in the way the sea behaves now, always moving, always responding, never again held in place by something so strange, so complete, and so perfectly unclassifiable. The difference continues to express itself, even in how modern understanding is structured. Contemporary science is built around detection, categorization, and response. It is optimized for systems that announce themselves through change. The ancient entity existed in a regime where change was precisely what was minimized. As a result, modern analytical tools encounter a blind spot when applied backward. They are calibrated to notice disturbance, not restraint. Where nothing happened, they see nothing. This blind spot is not an error of method, but a consequence of history. Methods evolve in response to the world they are used to study. As the ocean became faster and more reactive, science followed, developing instruments sensitive to fluctuation, boundaries, and events. The earlier ocean required a different sensibility, one attuned to absence, duration, and statistical improbability. That sensibility is harder to maintain because it offers fewer immediate rewards. Immediate rewards shape curiosity. Dramatic phenomena attract attention. Quiet ones require justification. The unclassifiable creature offered none. It did not threaten, dazzle, or disrupt. It did not generate crises that demanded explanation. It existed in a way that rendered inquiry unnecessary. When it was present, the system behaved as expected. Only when it was gone did expectation fail. This inversion of notice is crucial. Most scientific discoveries begin with surprise. The entity produced the opposite effect. It suppressed surprise. It made the ocean boring in the most productive sense of the word. Boring systems are efficient. They waste little energy on correction. They do not demand constant vigilance. They endure. Endurance, however, is easily mistaken for inevitability. Long-lived conditions are assumed to be permanent. When they end, the end feels abrupt, even if it is gradual. The unclassifiable creature's disappearance followed this pattern. By the time its absence mattered, it was already complete. The ocean did not transition overnight. It drifted. Drift is difficult to assign cause to because it lacks inflection points. There is no single moment to point to, no event to mark. Drift is the accumulation of small changes that individually seem inconsequential. Only after sufficient accumulation does a new regime emerge, fully formed and apparently self-sustaining. By the time the new regime stabilized, the old one was inaccessible. The conditions that had allowed the entity to exist were no longer present. Attempts to model the past using the present failed quietly, producing small inconsistencies rather than outright contradictions. These inconsistencies were tolerated, adjusted for, and eventually normalized. Normalization is how absence becomes invisible. Over long spans, the memory of the earlier calm faded not only from the system, but from imagination. Life was reinterpreted as inherently competitive, inherently unstable, inherently reactive. These interpretations fit the modern ocean well, so they were projected backward. The idea that life could once have stabilized an entire system through integration rather than interaction felt increasingly implausible, not because evidence argued against it, but because intuition had shifted. Intuition follows environment. In a world where survival depends on constant response, it is hard to imagine survival through stillness. In a world where boundaries matter, it is hard to imagine life without edges. The unclassifiable creature violates these intuitions because it belonged to a world where different assumptions held. The persistence of its story is therefore not about insistence, but about correction. It corrects for a bias introduced by temporal proximity. It reminds that present conditions are not neutral observers of the past. They distort interpretation by making certain strategies feel natural and others feel impossible. Once this correction is applied, the narrative stabilizes. The creature does not need to be defended or sensationalized. It occupies its place naturally as a consequence of conditions rather than an exception to rules. Its strangeness lies not in its nature, but in the fact that the rules governing its viability no longer apply. From this perspective, classification failure becomes meaningful rather than problematic. Classification failed because it was never designed to describe solutions that dissolve boundaries instead of reinforcing them. Taxonomy assumes separability. The entity demonstrated that separability is optional under certain regimes. This realization does not dismantle taxonomy. It contextualizes it. It shows that classification is a tool suited to particular environmental states. When those states change, the tool loses reach. That loss does not reflect error. It reflects transition. The underwater creature too strange to be classified existed at the margin of what classification can describe. It lived in the overlap between organism and system, where identity is secondary to effect. Its effect was stability. Its identity was irrelevant. When stability ceased to be advantageous, identity returned to prominence. Life fragmented into forms that could be counted, compared, and named. Science followed, refining its ability to study those forms in ever greater detail. In doing so, it lost fluency in reading the quiet languages of integration. Recovering that fluency does not require abandoning rigor. It requires expanding patience. It requires accepting that some truths emerge only when nothing happens for a very long time. It requires resisting the urge to fill silence with assumptions. The silence left by the unclassifiable creature is not empty. It is structured. It tells a story of a world that once did not need to react to itself constantly. A world where life could solve problems so completely that the solutions disappeared into the background. That world is gone. The creature is gone with it. What remains is a faster ocean and a louder record, rich with events and poor in restraint. Understanding the difference between those states is enough. It completes the narrative without closure, honors absence without mystification, and leaves open the possibility that, under conditions yet unknown, life may again choose to disappear into function rather than stand apart. That possibility does not need to be feared or celebrated. It only needs to be acknowledged as part of what life can do when given time, stability, and space enough to become unrecognizable as anything other than the world itself. The acknowledgement of that possibility alters the final posture toward the unknown. It replaces the expectation of discovery with an acceptance of recurrence under constraint. If the underwater creature was not a singular accident but a consequence of alignment, then its relevance is not confined to one era. It becomes an illustration of how life behaves when freed from the pressures that currently define it. In such moments, life does not diversify endlessly or sharpen itself into conflict. It settles. Settling is counterintuitive. It feels passive, yet it is an active resolution of tension. When gradients flatten and excess is absorbed, systems stop advertising themselves. They continue functioning, but without calling attention to that function. The ancient ocean, shaped by the unclassifiable entity, was such a system. It did not need constant correction because correction was built into its slowest processes. Life participated not by reacting, but by being present at sufficient scale to matter continuously. The modern ocean, by contrast, has outsourced regulation to interaction. It relies on feedback rather than inertia, on speed rather than weight. This makes it adaptive, but also restless. Restlessness produces information. Information produces narratives. Narratives produce understanding that feels complete because it is detailed. Yet detail is not the same as depth. The story of the unclassifiable creature restores depth by reminding that some regimes leave few details precisely because they work too well. They do not generate crises. They do not demand explanation. They do not carve themselves into the record with violence or novelty. They simply persist until they no longer fit. This is why the creature's absence does not feel like a mystery in the end. It feels like a boundary between ways of being. On one side, life is integration. On the other, life is negotiation. Both are valid. Both are contingent. Neither is permanent. The temptation to search for remnants, to imagine survivors, to hope for rediscovery misunderstands the nature of what existed. There is nothing to rediscover, because there was never an object to recover. There was only a configuration, and that configuration no longer assembles itself under current conditions. Expecting it to do so would be like expecting calm to reappear in a storm without the factors that once suppressed turbulence. Understanding this allows the narrative to rest. Not conclude, but rest. It no longer strains toward proof or denial. It accepts that some chapters of Earth's history are written in behavior rather than matter, in absence rather than presence. These chapters are harder to read, but they are no less real. The underwater creature too strange to be classified did not challenge biology by exceeding its rules. It revealed that the rules themselves are conditional, shaped by environment, time, and scale. Under one set of conditions, life fragments and competes. Under another, it consolidates and disappears into function. Both outcomes are natural. The ocean has expressed both. It may express them again. What remains for understanding is humility, the recognition that not everything important leaves a name, a body, or a trace that can be held. Some things matter only while they are present, and when they leave, the world moves on so smoothly that only careful comparison reveals what changed. That is the quiet legacy of the unclassifiable creature. It did not need to be seen to matter. It did not need to be remembered to have shaped an era. It existed long enough to make an entire system behave as though nothing extraordinary was happening. And when that behavior ended, extraordinariness returned. The sea grew louder. Life adapted. The silence receded into history, not as a mystery, but as a reminder that the most complete solutions often erase themselves so thoroughly that their absence feels like the natural state of things. Only patience reveals otherwise. The acknowledgement of that possibility alters the final posture toward the unknown. It replaces the expectation of discovery with an acceptance of recurrence under constraint. If the underwater creature was not a singular accident, but a consequence of alignment, then its relevance is not confined to one era. It becomes an illustration of how life behaves when freed from the pressures that currently define it. In such moments, life does not diversify endlessly or sharpen itself into conflict. It settles. Settling is counterintuitive. It feels passive, yet it is an active resolution of tension. When gradients flatten and excess is absorbed, systems stop advertising themselves. They continue functioning, but without calling attention to that function. The ancient ocean, shaped by the unclassifiable entity, was such a system. It did not need constant correction, because correction was built into its slowest processes. Life participated not by reacting, but by being present at sufficient scale to matter continuously. The modern ocean, by contrast, has outsourced regulation to interaction. It relies on feedback rather than inertia, on speed rather than weight. This makes it adaptive, but also restless. Restlessness produces information. Information produces narratives. Narratives produce understanding that feels complete because it is detailed. Yet detail is not the same as depth. The story of the unclassifiable creature restores depth by reminding that some regimes leave few details precisely because they work too well. They do not generate crises. They do not demand explanation. They do not carve themselves into the record with violence or novelty. They simply persist until they no longer fit. This is why the creature's absence does not feel like a mystery in the end. It feels like a boundary between ways of being. On one side, life is integration. On the other, life is negotiation. Both are valid. Both are contingent. Neither is permanent. The temptation to search for remnants, to imagine survivors, to hope for rediscovery, misunderstands the nature of what existed. There is nothing to rediscover because there was never an object to recover. There was only a configuration, and that configuration no longer assembles itself under current conditions. Expecting it to do so would be like expecting calm to reappear in a storm without the factors that once suppressed turbulence. Understanding this allows the narrative to rest, not conclude, but rest. It no longer strains toward proof or denial. It accepts that some chapters of Earth's history are written in behavior rather than matter, in absence rather than presence. These chapters are harder to read, but they are no less real. The underwater creature too strange to be classified did not challenge biology by exceeding its rules. It revealed that the rules themselves are conditional, shaped by environment, time, and scale. Under one set of conditions, life fragments and competes. Under another, it consolidates and disappears into function. Both outcomes are natural. The ocean has expressed both. It may express them again. What remains for understanding is humility, the recognition that not everything important leaves a name, a body, or a trace that can be held. Some things matter only while they are present, and when they leave, the world moves on so smoothly that only careful comparison reveals what changed. That is the quiet legacy of the unclassifiable creature. It did not need to be seen to matter. It did not need to be remembered to have shaped an era. It existed long enough to make an entire system behave as though nothing extraordinary was happening. And when that behavior ended, extraordinariness returned. The sea grew louder. Life adapted. The silence receded into history, not as a mystery, but as a reminder that the most complete solutions often erase themselves so thoroughly that their absence feels like the natural state of things. Only patience reveals otherwise. The return of that louder state reshaped not only ecosystems, but expectation itself. Once volatility became normal, calm began to look suspicious. Stability demanded explanation, while instability required none. This inversion quietly rewrote intuition. Systems that fluctuated were seen as healthy, dynamic, alive. Systems that did not were assumed to be constrained, limited, or incomplete. The ancient ocean, viewed through this new lens, appeared artificial in its restraint, as though something had been holding it back. That perception was accurate, but the implication was wrong. What held it back was not deficiency. It was sufficiency. Sufficiency is rarely visible because it does not strive. It does not expand, signal, or optimize beyond need. The unclassifiable creature embodied sufficiency so completely that it left no narrative hooks behind. There was no escalation, no arms race, no collapse to mark its relevance. Its role was to make escalation unnecessary. Once escalation returned, it seemed natural to assume that nothing had been lost, only that life had become more expressive. Expressiveness, however, is not the same as capacity. The modern ocean expresses itself constantly because it must. Energy enters unevenly. Nutrients arrive in pulses. Disturbance is frequent. To survive, life must react quickly, communicate intensely, and reproduce aggressively. These traits are impressive, but they are compensations. They exist because the system no longer absorbs imbalance quietly. The ancient ocean did not require compensation, it required presence. Presence at that scale cannot be dramatic. It cannot afford peaks or troughs. It must remain close to average, close to equilibrium, close to invisibility. The creature too strange to be classified achieved that state not by suppressing life, but by integrating with its slowest dimensions. It did not operate on the timescale of seasons or generations, but on the timescale of basins and epochs. To anything moving faster than that, it appeared static. To anything moving slower, it was simply part of the environment. This mismatch of timescales explains why its influence escaped notice for so long. Observation favors events. The entity was duration. It favored continuity over outcome. Its success lay in preventing thresholds from being crossed, rather than in producing effects that could be measured immediately. It shaped probability distributions, rather than individual trajectories. This kind of influence only becomes apparent when it is removed and the distributions widen. When widening occurred, it did not point backward clearly. The increase in variability could be attributed to many factors: climate shifts, tectonics, circulation changes. All of these played roles. None, alone, accounted for the degree of change observed. The unclassifiable creature did not replace these explanations. It connected them. It explained why they mattered more after a certain point than before. Before its absence, perturbations were absorbed. After its absence, they propagated. This difference is subtle but decisive. It determines whether systems dampen or amplify change. The ancient ocean dampened. The modern ocean amplifies. Life evolved accordingly. Amplification favors visibility. It rewards traits that announce themselves: speed, aggression, reproduction, signaling. These traits leave abundant evidence. They dominate the record. Over time, they come to define what life is assumed to be. Quiet strategies fade from imagination because they leave little behind. Yet imagination is not a measure of possibility. It is a measure of familiarity. The unclassifiable creature feels alien because it no longer fits familiar constraints. It solved a problem that no longer exists in the same form. That does not make the solution invalid. It makes it obsolete. Obsolescence, in nature, is clean. There is no nostalgia. There is no archive. When a solution no longer fits, it disappears entirely, leaving space for others to emerge. The ocean does not preserve alternatives. It moves forward with whatever works now. This forward motion can obscure the fact that what works now is not necessarily what worked best before. The modern ocean is not superior to the ancient one. It is adapted to different conditions. It trades endurance for flexibility, integration for responsiveness, silence for signal. These trades produce richness, but also fragility. They produce systems that recover quickly, but rarely rest. The ancient ocean rested. That rest was not inactivity. It was regulation. It was life holding the system in a narrow band of behavior, where surprises were rare and change was slow. The unclassifiable creature was not the sole source of that regulation, but it was a central one. It provided a scale of influence that no network of smaller organisms could replicate efficiently. Once that scale vanished, networks replaced it. Networks are powerful, but they require constant adjustment. They are always on the verge of reconfiguration. They never settle completely. This unsettledness is now mistaken for vitality. The story of the underwater creature too strange to be classified does not argue against vitality. It argues for plurality in how vitality can manifest. Sometimes vitality is motion. Sometimes it is stillness. Sometimes it is loud. Sometimes it is silent. Life explores all of these when given the opportunity. The ancient ocean gave life the opportunity to become invisible through success. The modern ocean does not. It demands participation at every moment. It demands response. It demands signal. That difference is not moral. It is conditional. Understanding this does not require extending the story toward speculation or future prediction. It requires letting the story remain what it is, an account of a mode of existence that no longer applies, but once did so thoroughly that its passing reshaped the meaning of normal. The creature was not strange because it violated rules. It was strange because it revealed how flexible the rules are. It showed that life can occupy roles so diffuse and so complete that the very act of naming them becomes unnecessary. When such roles disappear, the world becomes busier, clearer, easier to describe. It also becomes less held. The ocean today is alive in ways that are easy to witness. The ancient ocean was alive in ways that were easy to overlook. Between those two states lies the full range of what life can be, when time is abundant and constraint is gentle enough to allow solutions that erase themselves through perfection. That erasure through perfection is the most difficult idea to retain because it contradicts the expectation that success should leave monuments. In human systems, success accumulates structures, records, expansions. In natural systems, success often removes the need for further construction. When a solution fits completely, it stops drawing attention to itself. The underwater creature existed at that threshold, where effectiveness became indistinguishable from background condition. This is why its story resists ending in the conventional sense. There is no final act, no decisive disappearance, no point at which the narrative resolves into closure. Instead, there is only a gradual redistribution of burden. Functions once carried by a single, integrated presence were broken apart and spread across many faster, smaller processes. Regulation became local rather than global. Stability became conditional rather than intrinsic. The ocean adapted to this change without hesitation. It always does. What changed was not its capacity for life, but the style of that life. Where continuity once dominated, contingency took over. Where persistence once mattered most, adaptability became paramount. These shifts rewrote the grammar of marine existence, favoring forms that could tolerate interruption over those that required constancy. In such a grammar, the unclassifiable creature would not merely struggle, it would fail to assemble at all. Its existence depended on a long, uninterrupted conversation between environment and biology, a conversation that modern conditions interrupt too frequently. Each disturbance, each pulse, each abrupt gradient would tear coherence apart before it could stabilize. The pattern would never fully form. This explains why the entity cannot be recreated experimentally or observed under controlled conditions. It was not the product of a narrow set of parameters, but of sustained alignment across time. Time, more than any variable, is what modern systems cannot provide. Disturbance arrives too often. Change accumulates too quickly. The window closes before convergence can complete. The ancient ocean kept that window open. For millions of years, conditions varied within narrow bounds. This allowed life to experiment not only with form, but with mode. It explored what happens when reaction is minimized, when feedback is slow, when mass replaces motion as the primary stabilizer. The unclassifiable creature was the outcome of that exploration. Once the experiment ended, life did not mourn it. Evolution does not preserve what no longer functions. It moves on, relentlessly efficient. What remains is not loss, but transformation. The modern ocean is not a degraded version of the ancient one. It is a different expression of the same underlying drive to persist under constraint. Yet something subtle was traded away. The capacity for long, quiet equilibrium diminished. Systems became more expressive but less patient. They could respond quickly, but they could not rest deeply. This trade is visible everywhere in contemporary marine dynamics. Recovery is rapid, but complete stabilization is rare. Balance is achieved moment to moment, not era to era. The unclassifiable creature had enabled balance at the longest scale available. It was not immortal, but it was durable in a way few forms ever are. Its durability came not from resistance, but from fit. It fit so well that it vanished into the ocean's operating logic. When fit was lost, nothing dramatic occurred. There was no collapse because nothing had been built on top of it explicitly. The ocean simply became a place where more things happened more often. That increase in happening became the new normal, and with it, the new definition of life. This redefinition carries consequences for how the past is imagined. It biases interpretation toward action, struggle, and competition, because those are the processes that now dominate. Quiet integration becomes difficult to conceive because it is no longer rewarded. The story of the unclassifiable creature pushes back against that bias. It insists that life's repertoire is broader than what is currently visible. It also insists that absence can be meaningful without being mysterious. The creature is not hidden, it is obsolete, its world is gone. The conditions that made it viable dissolved, and with them, the solution dissolved as well. Expecting it to persist would be like expecting ice to remain solid in a warming sea. The absence is explained by context, not by secrecy. As understanding matures, this perspective no longer feels unsettling, it becomes clarifying. It allows ancient stability to be understood without invoking improbable coincidences. It allows modern volatility to be understood without invoking decline. Both are expressions of alignment between life and environment under different constraints. The story, therefore, does not demand continuation toward a climax. It has already reached its natural resting state. It ends not with an answer, but with a lens. A way of seeing how life can sometimes be most powerful when it is least visible, how systems can be most stable when they appear uneventful, and how the disappearance of such stability can redefine what is considered normal. The underwater creature too strange to be classified does not remain as a ghost, a legend, or a hypothesis awaiting proof. It remains as an implication, a reminder that life's influence does not scale linearly with its visibility, and that some of the most consequential chapters of Earth's history were written in a register so quiet that only their ending could ever be heard. The sea now speaks in faster rhythms. It will likely never return to that earlier silence. But the memory of what once made silence possible remains embedded in comparison, in the recognition that something once held the ocean steady long enough for nothing extraordinary to need to happen. And that recognition, finally, is enough. The recognition settles slowly, because it requires letting go of a habit that runs deep, the habit of equating activity with importance. In the modern ocean, activity is unavoidable. Currents shift, temperatures fluctuate, ecosystems reorganize constantly. Life responds at every scale, and that responsiveness dominates observation. Against this background, the idea that importance could once have been expressed through near inactivity feels counterintuitive. Yet counterintuitive does not mean incorrect. It means displaced in time. The ancient regime in which the unclassifiable creature existed did not eliminate motion. It redistributed it. Motion still occurred, but it was absorbed before it could cascade. Perturbations still arose, but they dissipated into a biological medium thick enough to smooth them out. The ocean functioned less like a resonant system and more like a damped one. Energy entered, circulated, and settled without amplifying itself into disruption. Damping is rarely dramatic. It does not announce itself. It does not create landmarks in the record. Its success is measured by the absence of extremes. This is why the creature's influence appears only as negative evidence. Fewer collapses than expected, fewer booms than predicted, fewer sharp transitions than models demand. To a mind trained to look for causes in events, this absence reads as nothing. To a mind trained to read systems, it reads as regulation. Once that regulation ended, the system crossed a threshold that could not be uncrossed. Feedback replaced inertia. Sensitivity replaced mass. The ocean did not become worse, it became faster. Speed brought advantages: rapid adaptation, high diversity, dynamic recovery. It also brought costs: fragility, volatility, dependence on constant adjustment. These costs are now treated as inherent features of marine life, but they are not timeless. They are conditional. The unclassifiable creature reminds us of that conditionality. It existed because the ocean once allowed life to operate as ballast. When ballast was no longer useful, life shed it. What followed was not emptiness, but motion. Motion filled the world with signals, interactions, and stories that could be traced and remembered. History, as it is usually told, begins where silence ends. This is why the earlier chapter feels elusive. It resists storytelling because it lacks protagonists and turning points. There is no rise and fall to dramatize, only a long period of sufficiency followed by a gradual shift in constraint. The creature does not star in this chapter. It permeates it. Its role cannot be isolated without dissolving its meaning. Attempts to compress that role into familiar biological language inevitably fail. Terms like organism, species, population all imply boundaries. The entity operated beyond boundaries. It was not bounded because bounding would have undermined its function. It did not need to protect itself from an environment it was aligned with. It did not need to reproduce in the conventional sense because persistence did not require replacement. Its continuity was systemic, not genealogical. This challenges another assumption, that life must perpetuate itself through lineage to be considered successful. The unclassifiable creature demonstrates a different form of success, one measured by duration of effect rather than continuity of form. Its offspring were not descendants, but conditions that persisted while it was present. When those conditions changed, there was nothing to inherit. Such a form of existence sits awkwardly with narratives centered on survival and competition. It suggests that under some regimes, the goal of life is not to outcompete, but to coincide. To fit so completely into its context that differentiation becomes unnecessary. In that state, individuality fades, and with it, the markers that usually draw attention. The fading was total. When the ocean crossed into a regime that rewarded speed over weight, the entity did not struggle to adapt. There was no adaptive pathway available that preserved its defining feature. Fragmentation would have destroyed coherence. Acceleration would have destroyed integration. The only outcome was dissolution. Dissolution, however, was not loss in the sense usually imagined. Nothing collapsed. Nothing depended exclusively on the entity's continued presence. Its influence had been infrastructural, not relational. When it withdrew, the infrastructure was replaced gradually by networks of interaction that could approximate some of its functions imperfectly. The ocean did not fail, it reorganized. That reorganization defines the present. It defines why the modern ocean feels alive in a restless way, why it is constantly doing something observable, why it produces endless data. It also defines why stability now appears temporary and hard-won. The long, effortless calm of the earlier regime is no longer accessible. Understanding this does not diminish modern life. It contextualizes it. It shows that what feels fundamental today, competition, variability, responsiveness, is one solution among others, shaped by constraint rather than destiny. The unclassifiable creature stands as evidence that life's strategies are broader than what survives in any one era. The story, therefore, does not move toward revelation, because revelation would imply that something hidden is about to be uncovered. There is nothing hidden, there is only something finished. The entity completed its role and left no residue, because residue would have implied inefficiency. Its success lay in leaving nothing behind except a changed world. The ocean now carries that change as its baseline. It no longer remembers the weight it once held, only the motion that replaced it. To recognize what was lost requires comparison, patience, and a willingness to treat silence as data rather than absence. When that willingness is applied, the underwater creature too strange to be classified becomes less strange. It becomes an example of how life, under the right conditions, can step beyond the boundaries that later generations mistake for laws. It shows that classification fails, not only when something is too complex, but when something is too complete. And with that understanding, the narrative finally reaches its natural limit, not an ending, but a saturation point, where adding more words would only circle the same insight from new angles. The creature does not need further description. Its essence lies in the fact that it does not resolve into description at all. The ocean moved from silence to sound, from weight to motion, from integration to interaction. Life followed, as it always does. What remains is the knowledge that, once, life solved the problem of excess so thoroughly that it erased itself into the solution. That knowledge is quiet, and it does not ask to be classified. The quietness of that knowledge does not diminish its weight. It sits beneath interpretation like pressure beneath the surface, shaping conclusions without announcing itself. Once acknowledged, it becomes difficult to ignore because it explains not only what once existed, but why modern explanations so often feel incomplete. The tendency to treat instability as inherent, to assume that systems must always be in motion to remain alive, is revealed as a product of present conditions rather than a universal truth. The ancient ocean contradicts that assumption gently. It demonstrates that life can persist without constant display, that equilibrium can be active rather than static, and that regulation does not require command or reaction. The unclassifiable creature embodied these principles not as an exception, but as their fullest expression. It did not impose order, it occupied it. Occupation at that scale reshapes meaning. To occupy is not to dominate or control, but to fill sufficiently that nothing else must compensate. The entity filled ecological space the way mass fills gravity wells, altering trajectories without contact. Other organisms did not respond to it because response was unnecessary. Their world was already moderated. Selection pressures remained narrow. Extremes were rare. Life proceeded without urgency. Urgency arrived only after that moderation ended. When it did, it rewrote the tempo of everything that followed. Evolution sped up. Ecosystems grew sensitive. Climate signals propagated more efficiently through biological networks. The ocean became a place where nothing could afford to be inert. Even the largest organisms had to move, migrate, respond. Inertia became vulnerability. This reversal makes the past difficult to imagine honestly. Modern intuition treats inertia as weakness, slowness as inefficiency, invisibility as irrelevance. Yet those traits were once the most economical way for life to exist. They reduced cost, minimized waste, and stabilized systems over immense spans of time. The unclassifiable creature was not a failure to evolve further. It was evolution reaching a local optimum under conditions that no longer apply. Local optima are rarely preserved once conditions change. They are abandoned abruptly, not gradually improved upon. This is why the entity leaves no descendants, no transitional forms, no degraded echoes. There was nowhere for it to go. Fragmentation would have destroyed the very coherence that defined it. Adaptation would have required abandoning its purpose. When purpose vanished, so did form. The absence of struggle in this process is perhaps the most unsettling aspect. There was no drama, no collapse, no crisis. The entity did not resist its own obsolescence. It did not fight extinction because extinction was not experienced as loss. It was simply the end of alignment. Life withdrew from a role it no longer needed to play. This withdrawal altered the meaning of success. After it, success came to be measured in adaptability, speed, and reproductive output. Before it, success had been measured in persistence and integration. Both metrics are valid within their respective regimes. Neither is absolute. The story of the underwater creature too strange to be classified therefore functions less as a tale of anomaly and more as a correction to perspective. It reveals that what is considered fundamental in one era may be irrelevant in another. It reminds that life strategies are not bound to form, but to fit. When fit changes, strategies change completely. Understanding this does not require belief in a specific morphology or mechanism. It requires acceptance that biology can sometimes operate at scales and in modes that dissolve the distinctions on which classification depends. Under such conditions, the failure to classify is not a failure of knowledge, but a signal that the object of study lies outside the domain for which the tool was designed. Classification is a product of fragmentation. It excels when life is divided into units that interact, compete, and diverge. It struggles when life converges into coherence, so complete that individuality loses relevance. The unclassifiable creature belonged to that latter state. It did not need a name because it did not need distinction. When distinction returned as a necessity, names proliferated, species multiplied, lineages branched. The ocean became crowded with identities. This crowding produced the rich biological record that dominates understanding today. It also obscured the possibility that once identity itself had been optional. That possibility remains uncomfortable because it challenges the narrative of progress. It suggests that some forms of life achieve a kind of completeness that does not lead to further elaboration. They do not evolve toward greater complexity. They settle, they persist, and then they end, not because they fail, but because the world no longer asks the question they answer. The unclassifiable creature answered a question about excess, stability, and time. When that question changed, the answer ceased to appear. No trace was left because nothing needed to be dismantled. The solution simply stopped being instantiated. This understanding does not diminish the richness of what followed. It frames it. The modern ocean, alive with motion and diversity, is a response to conditions that no longer permit deep integration. Its vibrancy is real, but it is also costly. It requires constant regulation through interaction rather than through presence. It never rests. The ancient ocean rested because something rested within it. That rest is gone. The silence is gone. What remains is awareness that silence was once possible, not as absence of life, but as its most complete expression. And with that awareness, the narrative reaches its natural boundary, not because there is nothing more to say, but because everything essential has already been said in different words. The underwater creature too strange to be classified was not meant to be understood through accumulation of detail. It was meant to be understood through acceptance of limits, of language, of taxonomy, of present intuition. It existed where those limits did not yet apply. Now they do. The ocean has moved on, carrying with it a history that cannot be reconstructed fully, only inferred through contrast. That contrast is enough. It allows the past to be acknowledged without being reduced, and the present to be understood without being mistaken for permanence. The creature is gone. The understanding remains. And that, finally, is sufficient. What remains to be articulated is not a new idea, but the endurance of the same one under repetition. Endurance itself was the defining property of the unclassifiable creature, and the narrative mirrors it by refusing to resolve into a single terminating insight. The story persists because the condition it describes once persisted, and persistence does not announce an endpoint. It simply continues until it no longer can. The ancient ocean allowed that continuation by minimizing interruption. Disturbance existed, but it rarely accumulated. Fluctuations arose, but they were absorbed before cascading. The creature's role was not to suppress change, but to slow it enough that systems could equilibrate internally. This slowing is easily underestimated because it produces no visible markers. It does not look like action. It looks like nothing happening. Nothing happening over long spans is transformative. When nothing happens long enough, life stops bracing itself. Defensive traits atrophy. Excessive responsiveness becomes wasteful. Systems relax into narrower bands of behavior. This relaxation is not fragility, it is efficiency. The unclassifiable creature existed in and reinforced that relaxed state. It allowed the ocean to remain productive without becoming anxious. Anxious systems behave differently. They externalize energy. They generate signal. They overcorrect. The modern ocean exhibits these traits clearly. Its abundance is punctuated by collapse. Its stability is local and temporary. It survives through constant adjustment rather than through sustained alignment. This mode is effective, but it is costly. It requires perpetual effort. Effort leaves traces. Effort produces evidence. That evidence fills the fossil record, the data sets, the narratives. Over time, it becomes tempting to assume that what leaves the most evidence is what mattered most. The unclassifiable creature stands as a counterexample. It mattered precisely because it left so little. This inversion challenges a deeply rooted assumption that significance scales with detectability. In reality, detectability often scales with inefficiency. Systems that must react constantly leave abundant records of reaction. Systems that are well regulated leave few. The ancient ocean, under the influence of the unclassifiable entity, was regulated to an extent that now feels unnatural only because regulation of that depth no longer exists. Once regulation fragmented, visibility increased, life became louder, interactions intensified, evolution accelerated. All of this feels dynamic, even heroic. It is easy to forget that dynamism often emerges when constraints fail. The unclassifiable creature prevented failure not by force, but by fit. Its existence made collapse unlikely by removing the conditions that would produce it. The modern ocean has no such removal. Collapse is managed, not prevented. Recovery replaces endurance. Systems are built to bounce back rather than to remain still. This difference defines nearly every contrast between ancient and modern marine dynamics. It also defines why the creature cannot be reconstructed. Reconstruction assumes something was broken and can be reassembled. Nothing broke. The conditions simply changed. Without those conditions, reassembly is impossible, not because the pieces are missing, but because the pattern no longer fits. Patterns are sensitive to context. They are not stored. They are enacted. When the enactment ceases, nothing remains to retrieve. This is the core difficulty in understanding life that operates as pattern rather than as object. Objects persist. Patterns do not. They must be continuously instantiated. The unclassifiable creature was continuously instantiated for as long as the ocean supported it. When support waned, instantiation ceased. The ocean did not notice in the moment. Only later did the consequences become apparent, and by then, the pattern was unrecoverable. This delay between cause and consequence further obscures the creature's role. Human intuition expects immediacy. It expects causes to precede effects closely in time. At planetary scales, this expectation fails. Effects can lag causes by millions of years. The creature's absence altered the ocean long before the ocean appeared different. When difference finally emerged, it was attributed to proximate factors rather than to the long-vanished regulator. This attribution is understandable. Proximate factors are easier to see. The unclassifiable creature, operating at the slowest scale, was already beyond reach of explanation by the time its absence mattered. The story, then, is not one of neglect or oversight. It is one of scale mismatch. Modern perception operates too quickly to notice what acts too slowly. The creature did not hide. It simply operated outside the bandwidth of attention. This realization does not invite despair. It invites recalibration. It suggests that understanding deep time requires not only better instruments, but different patience. It requires attention to what does not happen, to what fails to fluctuate, to what remains steady when it should not. Such attention is difficult to sustain because it offers no immediate reward. Yet it is the only way to approach phenomena whose success lies in erasing the need for observation. The underwater creature, too strange to be classified, achieved that success fully. It did not need recognition. It did not need memory. It existed to make the ocean quieter, slower, and more forgiving. When that forgiveness was no longer economical, it withdrew without protest. The ocean accepted the withdrawal and reorganized. Life adapted. Complexity increased. Noise returned. History, as it is commonly told, resumed. What preceded it remains a long, quiet interval that resists compression into narrative. It can only be approached through implication, through contrast, through the recognition that not all absence is empty. Some absence is the echo of something that once worked so well it disappeared into normality. That is the final continuity of the story. It does not conclude with a lesson, a warning, or a revelation. It concludes with alignment between understanding and limitation. The acceptance that some forms of life cannot be held, named, or finished in words, because their defining feature was the removal of the need for words at all. The ocean once lived inside such a condition. It no longer does. And knowing that difference is enough to let the story rest, not as an ending, but as a completed understanding that does not require further extension to remain true. The rest of the narrative unfolds not as a revelation, but as a slow settling into perspective, the way sediment eventually settles once turbulence subsides. What becomes clear, with enough distance, is that the unclassifiable creature was never meant to be an exception that challenged biology. It was a reminder that biology itself is not fixed in how it expresses agency. Agency does not always appear as action. Sometimes it appears as permission, the permission for systems to remain within narrow bounds without constant correction. In the ancient ocean, that permission was granted through scale and integration rather than through feedback and reaction. Life did not need to announce itself because it had already aligned itself with the largest, slowest forces shaping the environment. The creature existed where gradients were long, where cycles were deep, where time itself was elastic enough to accommodate persistence without urgency. It was not optimized for survival in a hostile world. It was optimized for remaining where hostility rarely emerged. As those conditions eroded, the ocean did not become hostile in a dramatic sense. It became busy. Busyness replaced calm as the dominant texture of existence. This busyness required new strategies. Boundaries hardened. Organisms began to specialize, not because specialization was superior, but because generality became too expensive. Integration across scale gave way to negotiation across interfaces. Life became modular. Modularity is powerful. It allows rapid reconfiguration. It allows failure to remain local. It allows diversity to explode. It also ensures that nothing ever truly rests. The modern ocean is modular in this sense. Its stability is emergent rather than imposed. It arises from countless interactions rather than from sustained presence. This makes it adaptable, but also perpetually incomplete. It is always in the process of stabilizing, never fully stabilized. The ancient ocean, by contrast, had reached a state of completion within its constraints. Completion does not mean perfection. It means that further change offered diminishing returns. The unclassifiable creature existed at that plateau. It was not evolving towards something else because there was nowhere else to go that offered advantage. Its form, or lack of form, represented a solution that had reached sufficiency. Sufficiency is difficult to imagine in a world defined by acceleration. Modern intuition assumes that systems must either grow, diversify, or collapse. The idea that a system might simply remain adequate for millions of years feels implausible only because such adequacy is no longer visible. The creature's story restores that possibility. It shows that life can sometimes reach a state where maintenance, rather than transformation, is the optimal path. Maintenance, however, leaves no monuments. It leaves continuity. Continuity is invisible until it ends. When it ends, the contrast is mistaken for progress. Faster change feels like advancement. Increased diversity feels like enrichment. Yet these are responses to loss of restraint as much as they are expressions of opportunity. The unclassifiable creature did not suppress opportunity. It filtered it. It allowed abundance without volatility, diversity without crisis, productivity without collapse. When it withdrew, opportunity became risk. Life adapted by becoming faster, more expressive, more transient. This adaptation was successful, but it carried a cost: the loss of deep, system-wide calm. That calm cannot be restored through individual action. It requires alignment across scales that modern conditions no longer support. This is why no equivalent entity exists today, and why none can be engineered or rediscovered. The creature was not a marvel of design. It was a convergence of circumstance. Remove the circumstance, and the convergence never occurs. Understanding this dissolves the remaining tension in the narrative. There is no unresolved mystery demanding solution. There is no hidden truth waiting beneath the surface. There is only a difference between worlds, separated not by catastrophe, but by drift. Drift changed the questions the ocean asked of life. Life answered differently. The underwater creature, too strange to be classified, answered a question about how to remain abundant without becoming unstable. It answered by becoming invisible through effectiveness. When that question ceased to matter, the answer ceased to appear. Nothing about this is tragic. Nothing about it is triumphant. It is simply descriptive. Life adapts to constraint. When constraints change, adaptations vanish. Some leave fossils. Some leave stories. Some leave only a change in how the world behaves afterward. This creature left the last kind. And so the narrative reaches its true end not because it stops, but because it no longer needs continuation. The pattern has been described fully enough to be recognized without repetition. The silence has been translated as far as language allows. Beyond this point, words add volume but not depth. The ocean continues, restless and articulate, filled with forms that can be seen, named, and measured. The earlier quiet remains inaccessible except through comparison. It does not ask to be revived or remembered. It simply reminds that life, under the right conditions, can solve its problems so completely that it erases the need to be noticed at all. That is where the story rests. What follows can only deepen the same terrain, because the terrain itself was never meant to culminate in a single peak. It is a plain rather than a mountain, defined by extent rather than height. The unclassifiable creature belonged to such a landscape of existence, one where significance was measured horizontally across time and system, rather than vertically, through moments of intensity. As the ocean settled fully into its newer, faster regime, the memory of horizontal significance faded almost entirely. Scientific language adapted to verticality, spikes, crashes, events, thresholds. These concepts describe a world where change matters more than duration. They are effective tools for interpreting a reactive system. They are blunt instruments when applied to a world that once valued persistence above all else. Persistence does not generate thresholds. It erases them. When a system remains within narrow bounds long enough, boundaries stop being crossed because there is no incentive to approach them. The unclassifiable creature existed in service of that erasure. It did not patrol limits. It made limits irrelevant by smoothing the gradients that led toward them. Its influence was preventative rather than corrective. Preventative influence is the least visible kind. It produces no aftermath, only continuity. When continuity breaks, the break is attributed to whatever is immediately present, not to what is no longer there. This is why the creature's absence was never recognized as an event. There was no before and after moment, only a gradual widening of possibility that life rushed to fill. Life always rushes to fill possibility. In the modern ocean, possibility appears constantly because regulation is fragmented. Each opening invites specialization, adaptation, and divergence. The result is richness without repose. The system becomes crowded with solutions that are brilliant but short-lived. They succeed intensely and fail quickly, leaving behind records dense with motion. The ancient ocean did not produce such records because it did not require such solutions. The unclassifiable creature absorbed excess before it could create openings that demanded rapid exploitation. In doing so, it reduced the selective advantage of novelty. Innovation slowed because it was unnecessary. Stability rewarded sufficiency rather than ingenuity. This inversion of evolutionary pressure is difficult to accept because it contradicts the narrative that evolution always trends toward complexity. In reality, evolution trends toward adequacy. Complexity arises when adequacy demands it. When it does not, complexity recedes. The unclassifiable creature existed at a point where complexity beyond integration offered no benefit. Integration at that scale does not look like complexity from the outside. It looks like absence of structure because structure has dissolved into function. The entity had no outline because outline was wasteful. It had no identifiable organs because specialization was unnecessary. It had no reproductive cycle because replacement was not required. It existed as long as the environment allowed it to remain assembled. Assembly is a crucial word here. The creature was assembled continuously, not once. It did not originate at a single moment. It emerged gradually as alignment strengthened. Its birth was not an event, but a convergence. Likewise, its death was not an event, but a divergence. When alignment weakened, assembly failed. Nothing broke, nothing ended. The pattern simply stopped appearing. Patterns that stop appearing leave no remains. They leave only a change in probability space. The ocean began to allow outcomes that had once been rare. Variability increased. Extremes became possible. Life adapted to this expanded space quickly, filling it with motion and interaction. That filling obscured the absence that had created the space in the first place. Over time, the expanded space became the baseline. New life forms evolved under its assumptions. They treated instability as normal. They treated rapid change as a given. The idea that the ocean could once have supported a form of life that thrived by minimizing change became increasingly alien. Alien, however, does not mean impossible. It means distant from current experience. The story of the unclassifiable creature serves to bridge that distance, not by forcing belief, but by restoring plausibility. It shows that the ocean's past did not merely contain different species. It contained different modes of existence. Modes of existence do not fossilize. They are inferred through system behavior. When that behavior shifts, the mode is lost to direct observation. Only careful comparison reveals that something fundamental has changed. That comparison is the heart of the narrative, not the creature itself, but the difference between an ocean that could afford silence and one that cannot. An ocean where life could integrate deeply enough to disappear, and an ocean where life must constantly assert itself to survive. The unclassifiable creature belonged to the former. Its disappearance marked the irreversible transition to the latter. Everything that followed diversification, specialization, volatility was not the beginning of life's success, but the beginning of life's vigilance. Vigilance is expensive. It requires constant monitoring, constant adjustment, constant response. It produces a world that is vivid and fragile at the same time. The modern ocean embodies this state fully. The ancient ocean did not require vigilance. It required alignment. The creature provided that alignment by existing at sufficient scale to matter continuously. Its success lay in making vigilance unnecessary. When vigilance returned, it felt like awakening. History began to feel active. Stories became possible. The record filled with events. This activity is compelling, but it is also a sign of lost ease. Ease does not announce itself. It does not justify itself. It simply exists until it does not. That is why the unclassifiable creature cannot be recovered through effort. Effort belongs to a world where ease is gone. The creature belonged to a world where effort was minimized by design, not by intention, but by convergence. The narrative reaches its furthest extension here. Beyond this point, continuation would only repeat the same truth in thinner layers. The truth is not hidden, only unfamiliar. That life, given enough time and stability, may choose to disappear into function, rather than multiply into forms. The ocean once allowed that choice. It no longer does, and in that difference lies the full meaning of the underwater creature, too strange to be classified. The continuation, if it must exist, can only exist as refinement, because the substance of the story has already settled into its final shape. What remains is to trace the implications outward, the way ripples continue long after the initial disturbance has vanished, not because something new has occurred, but because the system is still adjusting to what is no longer there. One of those implications lies in how absence reshapes interpretation long after its cause has disappeared. The ocean learned to operate without the unclassifiable creature so thoroughly that its former presence became unnecessary even as a reference. New generations of life arose that had never experienced deep, system-wide restraint. For them, volatility was not a deviation, it was the environment itself. Adaptation became inseparable from identity. To exist was to respond. This shift altered the internal logic of ecosystems. Where once stability had been imposed from the slowest scale downward, stability now emerged from interaction at the fastest scales upward. Countless small processes replaced a single large one. The result was not chaos, but constant negotiation. Balance was no longer given. It was earned repeatedly, moment by moment, through feedback and adjustment. Such a system is resilient in a different way. It can tolerate frequent shocks because nothing is held too rigidly, but it also cannot rest. It cannot afford long periods of inattention. Everything depends on everything else reacting correctly and quickly enough. The ocean became a place where life survived by staying alert. Alertness leaves marks. It leaves traces of reaction, of adaptation, of stress. These traces are what dominate understanding now. They fill models, narratives, and expectations. Against this background, the idea that life once stabilized the ocean through near invisibility feels almost paradoxical. Yet paradox dissolves when context is restored. The ancient ocean did not require alertness because it was buffered. The buffer was biological, but not in a way that fits familiar categories. It was not a keystone species, not an apex predator, not a foundation organism. It was a state in which biology itself had thickened enough to slow the system. The unclassifiable creature was the expression of that thickening, not its cause in isolation. This distinction matters because it removes any temptation to mythologize. The creature was not unique by virtue of being singular. It was unique by virtue of representing a threshold crossed and later uncrossed. When life accumulated sufficient mass, coherence, and duration, it crossed into a mode where individuality ceased to matter. When conditions no longer supported that accumulation, the mode vanished completely. Nothing about this requires speculation beyond known principles. Systems under prolonged stability consolidate. Systems under variability fragment. Biology follows the same logic as everything else. What makes the unclassifiable creature difficult to accept is not its strangeness, but its completeness. It represents a solution that leaves no room for embellishment, conflict, or narrative tension. Narrative tension returns only when solutions fail or fragment. That is why history, as commonly understood, begins where the creature's story ends. The ocean became dynamic enough to produce events worth recording. Life became expressive enough to produce contrast. From that point on, stories multiplied. The earlier chapter remains resistant to storytelling because it lacked contrast. It lacked peaks and valleys. It was a long, even surface shaped by forces that operated too slowly to register as events. The unclassifiable creature belonged entirely to that surface. It did not rise above it. It did not break it. It was part of its flatness. Flatness, in deep time, is not emptiness. It is equilibrium maintained through integration rather than control. That equilibrium is now gone, not because it was fragile, but because the conditions that supported it dissolved. Once dissolved, no amount of searching can restore it. It was not stored anywhere. It was enacted continuously. This is the final implication. Some forms of life do not persist as memory, lineage, or object. They persist only as behavior, and when that behavior ends, nothing remains to retrieve. The unclassifiable creature was one such form. Its success ensured that it would not be remembered in the usual ways. The ocean moved on, carrying life into a state where visibility, speed, and reaction became necessary. That state feels normal now. It defines intuition. It shapes expectation. It determines what seems possible. Against that backdrop, the creature remains strange, not because it violated rules, but because it belonged to a world that no longer exists. A world where life could afford to be slow enough, large enough, and integrated enough to disappear into the system it stabilized. Nothing more needs to be added to that understanding. The story does not end with a discovery, a warning, or a moral. It ends with alignment between explanation and restraint. The recognition that some chapters of Earth's history were written so quietly that only their absence tells us they were ever there at all. The absence continued to echo, not as loss, but as a change in texture. The ocean's behavior acquired a grain it had not possessed before, a fine irregularity that propagated through every level of life. Where once processes blended smoothly into one another, they now rubbed, collided, and interfered. Boundaries mattered again. Distinctions sharpened. Life learned to exist in edges rather than in spans. Edges create stories. They create beginnings and endings, winners and failures, success and extinction. The modern record is rich because it is edged. The ancient record is sparse because it was continuous. The unclassifiable creature belonged entirely to that continuity. It did not occupy a niche in the modern sense. It dissolved the need for niches by smoothing the environment that would have created them. Once smoothing ended, niches proliferated. Each gradient became an opportunity. Each fluctuation became a test. Life responded with creativity because it had to. Creativity, however, is not free. It demands turnover. It demands experimentation. It demands loss. The ocean accepted these costs because there was no longer an alternative capable of absorbing them silently. This is the deeper reason why the ancient mode never returned. It was not merely that conditions changed. It was that once fragmentation became dominant, the path back to deep integration vanished. Fragmented systems resist consolidation. Their very success depends on diversity of response rather than unity of presence. To return to a state like the one that produced the unclassifiable creature would require not only stability, but a suspension of responsiveness long enough for convergence to occur again. That suspension has not happened. Instead, the ocean has remained in a state of perpetual adjustment. Even its calm periods are temporary, always shadowed by the expectation of disruption. life has internalized this expectation. It no longer relaxes into sufficiency. It prepares constantly for change. This preparedness defines modern vitality, but it also defines modern fragility. Systems held together by vigilance are resilient only as long as vigilance is maintained. The ancient ocean did not require vigilance. It was held together by mass, duration, and alignment. The unclassifiable creature embodied those qualities so completely that it vanished into them. Its role was not to watch, react, or decide. Its role was to be there, continuously, at a scale that mattered. Being there is not a dramatic act. It leaves no trace unless it stops. When it stopped, the ocean did not collapse. It accelerated. That acceleration became the new baseline. Over time, it was mistaken for progress, for advancement, for the natural expression of life. Only careful comparison reveals that it is also a compensation for the loss of something that once made compensation unnecessary. This realization reframes how limits are understood. Limits are often treated as ceilings imposed by physics or biology. In reality, many limits are negotiated outcomes between environment and life. When negotiation changes, limits shift. The ancient ocean negotiated with life in a way that allowed extreme integration. The modern ocean negotiates in a way that rewards fragmentation. Neither negotiation is permanent. They are states, not laws. The unclassifiable creature existed in one such state and vanished with it. Its story does not need a climax because its existence was never event-driven. It was condition-driven. Conditions arose, alignment followed, and life assembled into a form that no longer needed to distinguish itself from the system it stabilized. When conditions drifted, assembly ceased. Nothing broke. Nothing failed. The system simply asked a different question, and life answered differently. That is the quiet continuity underlying everything that followed. The ocean today, restless and articulate, carries within its behavior the negative imprint of what once slowed it. Not as memory, not as relic, but as contrast. The difference between a world that could afford silence and one that cannot. The underwater creature too strange to be classified does not demand belief or denial. It demands perspective. A willingness to accept that some solutions in Earth's history were so complete that they erased their own visibility, that some forms of life mattered not because they changed the world loudly, but because they prevented it from needing to change at all. With that acceptance, the narrative finally settles. There is nothing left to uncover because nothing was hidden. There is nothing left to explain because the explanation is structural rather than factual. The creature existed as long as it fit. When it no longer fit, it disappeared without residue. The ocean adapted. Life continued. Noise replaced silence. And the story ends there, not with a conclusion imposed, but with an understanding reached slowly enough to resemble the very condition it describes, a state where nothing more needs to happen for meaning to be complete. The understanding, once complete, does not collapse into certainty. It settles into tolerance. Tolerance for the idea that some chapters of natural history cannot be tightened into proof, cannot be reduced to specimens, and cannot be defended through demonstration. They can only be inferred through coherence. The unclassifiable creature belongs to that category, not as an omission in knowledge, but as a boundary of method. Method itself evolved in response to a louder world. As variability increased, tools were refined to capture change. Sensors improved, resolution sharpened, temporal scales shortened. The ocean became something to be tracked continuously rather than assumed stable by default. This methodological evolution mirrors biological evolution. Both respond to the same constraint, the disappearance of deep, passive regulation. In such a context, the ancient regime appears almost unreal, not because it contradicts physics, but because it contradicts habit. Habit trains perception. What is constantly encountered becomes natural. What is no longer encountered becomes implausible. The unclassifiable creature feels implausible because its mode of existence has no contemporary analog. There is nothing alive today that performs its role in the same way, at the same scale, with the same indifference to distinction. Yet absence of analog does not imply impossibility. It implies displacement. The conditions that once supported that mode have drifted far enough that reconstruction is no longer feasible. Even if similar alignments briefly arise, they are interrupted too quickly to allow convergence. Life begins to assemble toward integration, but fragmentation intervenes before completion. This incompletion defines the modern ocean. Many processes approach coherence. None sustain it long enough to dissolve individuality. The system oscillates around balance without settling into it. That oscillation produces a constant hum of activity, a background of motion that never fully quiets. Silence becomes an anomaly rather than the norm. The ancient ocean reversed that relationship. Silence was the baseline. Activity appeared only when forced. The unclassifiable creature did not create silence. It maintained it by absorbing the conditions that would have broken it. This maintenance was not active in the conventional sense. It was not responsive. It was simply present at sufficient scale to matter continuously. Scale, in this context, is not size alone. It is duration multiplied by integration. Many organisms are large. Few are integrated deeply enough to operate as conditions rather than actors. The creature crossed that threshold. It became less a participant and more a medium through which the ocean behaved. Once biology becomes medium, it disappears from view. Media are noticed only when they fail. The air is not observed until it thins. The water is not perceived until it moves violently. The unclassifiable creature functioned as a biological medium. Its withdrawal exposed the system to motion that had previously been damped. That exposure reshaped everything that followed. Life became expressive because expression was now necessary. Interaction intensified because mediation had weakened. Systems began to negotiate continuously rather than rest. This negotiation produced complexity that is fascinating, but it also produced fragility that is unavoidable. Fragility is not weakness. It is a property of systems optimized for speed rather than endurance. The modern ocean is resilient in bursts, not in spans. It recovers quickly, but rarely stabilizes deeply. It survives shocks, but it does not erase them. Each disturbance leaves an imprint that alters the next response. The ancient ocean erased disturbance quietly. Its responses were slow enough to blur events into averages. The unclassifiable creature enabled that erasure by existing as a long-term sink for variability. It did not eliminate change. It redistributed it across time so broadly that no moment carried excessive weight. This redistribution is the key difference. The modern ocean concentrates change into moments. The ancient ocean dispersed change across eras. Life evolved accordingly. In one regime, success meant reacting well. In the other, success meant remaining aligned. Alignment does not produce heroes or catastrophes. It produces continuity. Continuity resists narration. Stories require contrast. The unclassifiable creature lived in a world where contrast was minimized by design. Its story, therefore, cannot be told in the way stories usually are. It can only be approximated through repetition, through circling the same idea, until familiarity replaces resistance. That resistance comes from the expectation that meaning must be extracted from events. Here, meaning is extracted from their absence, from the long stretch during which nothing extraordinary occurred because nothing needed to, from the realization that such stretches are not empty, but full of work done so effectively that it vanishes into background. The creature's work was not to build, destroy, or compete. It was to hold. Holding is not passive. It is the maintenance of boundaries that never harden, of gradients that never steepen, of abundances that never spike. It is work that becomes invisible once it succeeds. When holding ceased, everything else had to work harder. Life compensated with speed, diversity, and signal. These compensations are impressive. They define the world now. They also ensure that no single form can ever again disappear so completely into function. The ocean has crossed a threshold beyond which deep biological invisibility is no longer economical. Any form that attempted it would be dismantled by variability before it could integrate. The unclassifiable creature belonged to the last interval before that threshold was crossed. This does not mean the story is nostalgic. There is no implication that the earlier regime was better. It was different. It optimized for endurance rather than adaptability. It minimized drama rather than generating it. The modern regime optimizes for responsiveness. Both are solutions to different constraints. What the story ultimately provides is not a preference, but a comparison. A reminder that what feels natural now is not eternal. That life strategies are contingent. That some of the most powerful expressions of life may leave no trace precisely because they succeed too completely. The underwater creature too strange to be classified was one such expression. It does not need further elaboration. Its meaning lies in the way it reframes absence, stability, and success. It invites attention not to what happened, but to what did not need to happen while it was there. The ocean no longer permits that state. And that, at last, is the full extent of the story, not as a conclusion imposed, but as a state reached, where nothing further needs to be added because the silence itself has been translated as far as language can carry it. The continuation exists only as a further thinning of distinction, because by now the narrative has crossed fully into the same mode as its subject. It is no longer describing an object. It is describing a condition, and conditions do not conclude so much as they fade into whatever replaces them. The unclassifiable creature has already done this within the story itself. What follows is the afterimage, the way the mind adjusts once a long-held pressure is removed and normal sensation returns altered. The ocean that followed learned to treat instability not as an anomaly, but as a resource. Fluctuation became opportunity. Stress became a driver. Life reorganized around cycles short enough to exploit change rather than resist it. This reorganization did not erase memory of the earlier state, but it buried it so deeply beneath new patterns that recognition required deliberate excavation. Without comparison, the faster rhythm felt natural. Without silence, noise felt complete. Completion, however, is deceptive. A system can be complete only relative to its constraints. The modern ocean is complete in the sense that it fills its available behavioral space densely. There is little unused potential. Every gradient is occupied. Every fluctuation is answered. This density creates richness, but it also creates saturation. There is no room left for solutions that require long, uninterrupted spans to assemble. Anything that cannot keep pace is dismantled before it coheres. The unclassifiable creature required pace so slow that it is no longer compatible with this saturation. It needed time without interference, variability without amplification, abundance without urgency. These conditions no longer coincide. Even when one appears briefly, the others do not. Convergence is attempted, but never completed. Patterns begin to form and then dissolve. Life reaches toward integration and is pulled back into fragmentation. This repeated failure leaves no trace because it never reaches critical mass. The ancient creature succeeded because it crossed that threshold once and remained there. It held coherence long enough to matter. Once that coherence was lost, the threshold receded beyond reach. The system reorganized around a different attractor, one that favors multiplicity over unity. Multiplicity produces narratives easily. There are always many things happening. Causes and effects can be traced. Events can be isolated. This makes the modern ocean legible. It also makes it misleading if legibility is mistaken for completeness. What is visible is not always what is most consequential. The unclassifiable creature demonstrates this by existing entirely outside visibility while shaping everything that followed. Its absence did not weaken the ocean. It changed the way strength was expressed. Strength shifted from endurance to adaptability, from weight to speed, from silence to signal. These shifts feel like progress because they produce activity. They also produce exhaustion. Systems that must constantly adjust never truly settle. They survive through motion rather than rest. Rest is now a temporary state. Calm periods are treated as interludes rather than baselines. The expectation of disruption is built into every level of life. This expectation shapes evolution, behavior, and perception. It also shapes interpretation of the past. A world without constant disruption feels implausible because it contradicts lived experience. The story of the underwater creature corrects that bias, not by insisting on belief, but by demonstrating internal consistency. It shows that a calm world is not an empty one. It is a world where work is done so continuously and evenly that it never accumulates into events. The creature's work was to distribute strain across time so broadly that no moment bore excess weight. This distribution ended. When it did, strain began to concentrate. Concentrated strain produces thresholds. Thresholds produce events. Events produce history. History, in turn, redefines what feels real. The long, eventless interval recedes into abstraction not because it was insignificant, but because it does not fit the grammar of storytelling that emerged afterward. Grammar matters. It determines what can be said and what must remain implied. The unclassifiable creature belongs to implication. It cannot be named without distortion. It cannot be bounded without loss. It can only be approached through repeated negation, not predator, not prey, not system, not species. Each exclusion narrows the space until what remains is not a thing, but a role. That role was to make the ocean uneventful. Uneventfulness is not failure. It is success of a particular kind. It is success measured not by achievement, but by avoidance. Avoidance of collapse, avoidance of excess, avoidance of escalation. When avoidance works perfectly, it leaves nothing to point to. Only when avoidance fails does its former presence become obvious. The modern ocean lives with failure in small doses constantly. It is built to recover rather than to prevent. This design is robust but restless. It cannot return to the earlier state because the pathways that led there have been erased by adaptation. The ocean has learned how to live without deep restraint, and that learning is irreversible. Irreversibility does not imply inevitability in the past. It only marks a boundary crossed. On one side, life could disappear into function. On the other, life must remain visible to survive. The unclassifiable creature stood at that boundary and belonged entirely to the former side. The narrative cannot move past this point without dissolving into repetition because the subject itself dissolves at this scale. What remains is a steady understanding that some forms of life are not remembered because remembering them would require a world slow enough to notice their absence only after they are gone. The ocean noticed too late and then moved on. Life adapted, as it always does. Noise replaced silence, and the creature, having never needed to be named, remains exactly what it always was, a solution that existed only while it was necessary and vanished without residue when it was not. That is not a mystery. It is alignment, and alignment, once broken, does not leave ruins. It leaves motion. The motion that followed alignment's end did not merely fill the space it left. It redefined what space itself meant. Where once the ocean behaved as a continuous field, it now behaved as a mosaic of interacting zones, each with its own tempo, its own thresholds, its own failures and recoveries. Continuity fractured into adjacency. What had been held together by duration was now held together by exchange. Life learned to exist not inside a system, but between systems. Between is an unstable place to live. It requires constant negotiation. It rewards awareness, flexibility, and speed. It punishes stillness. The modern ocean is a world of betweens, and its inhabitants reflect that condition perfectly. Nothing remains long enough to dissolve into background. Everything must assert presence or be overwritten by the next fluctuation. The ancient creature could never survive here, not because it was weak, but because the environment no longer tolerates solutions that depend on time rather than response. Time itself has changed character. In the earlier regime, time accumulated. It stretched. It allowed processes to complete without interruption. In the later regime, time fragments. It arrives in usable packets separated by disturbance. Life optimizes for these packets, learning to extract advantage quickly before conditions shift again. This optimization produces brilliance, but not depth. Depth requires patience. Patience requires stillness. Stillness is no longer stable. The unclassifiable creature belonged to an era when stillness was productive. Its existence assumed that tomorrow would resemble today closely enough to justify long-term investment in coherence. That assumption no longer holds. The modern ocean cannot promise resemblance, even across short spans. Its variability is not a flaw. It is a response to changed constraints. But that response excludes entire classes of solutions that once thrived. Exclusion does not mean error. It means narrowing. The space of viable life strategies has shifted. Where once it included disappearance into function, it now favors visibility and differentiation. This narrowing is subtle because it comes with an explosion of forms. Diversity increases even as the underlying modes of existence decrease. Many shapes, fewer ways of being. The ancient mode was one such way. It allowed life to become so integrated that it ceased to appear as life at all. It became infrastructure, then background, then assumption. When that assumption broke, the system recalibrated so thoroughly that it forgot the assumption had ever existed. Forgetting was not a choice. It was a consequence of adaptation. Adaptation rewrites memory. What is no longer useful becomes implausible. The unclassifiable creature feels implausible now because the world has adapted beyond it. Its logic no longer maps onto current experience. Yet the coherence of its effects remains detectable in the negative space it left behind. Calm intervals that are too long. Transitions that are too delayed. Systems that behaved as though something had been holding them steady even when no visible mechanism remains. These traces do not demand explanation in isolation. They become meaningful only when assembled into a pattern. That pattern does not point to a hidden monster or an undiscovered species. It points to a missing mode of regulation. It suggests that biology once operated not only as actor, but as medium. Medium is a difficult concept for life because it blurs agency. A medium shapes outcomes without choosing them. It influences without intent. It matters without identity. The unclassifiable creature functioned as such a medium. It did not decide. It persisted. Its persistence shaped the ocean more effectively than any sequence of events could have. When persistence ended, events returned. The ocean became eventful. History resumed. The record filled. From that point onward, the world became legible in the way legibility is usually understood. Causes led to effects quickly enough to be traced. Boundaries mattered. Stories emerged naturally. The earlier world did not generate stories because nothing stood out enough to become a story. The creature did not rise above its environment. It merged with it. Storytelling requires separation. It requires protagonists and contrasts. The unclassifiable creature refused, both by design of circumstance. This refusal is what gives the narrative its strange resistance to ending. There is no climax to reach. because nothing ever peaked. There is no revelation to uncover, because nothing was hidden. There is only a gradual shift from one regime to another, from a world where life could afford to disappear into stability to a world where life must remain visible to endure. The ocean crossed that boundary and did not look back, not because it rejected the earlier state, but because the pathways that led there were erased by change. Once erased, they cannot be retraced. Convergence requires continuity, and continuity has been broken too many times to be restored. This irreversibility gives the story its final shape. It is not open-ended in the sense of waiting for a sequel. It is open-ended in the sense that its lesson applies beyond its specific context. It shows that life's most effective strategies may not be those that dominate records or imaginations. They may be those that render themselves unnecessary by solving problems so completely that nothing else needs to happen. When such strategies vanish, what follows feels active, rich, and alive. It is, but it is also compensatory. Motion replaces weight. Reaction replaces presence. Noise replaces silence. The unclassifiable creature existed in the silence, not as absence, but as fullness so evenly distributed that it could not be heard. When it left, the sound returned, and the world learned to live with it. That learning defines the present. The past remains accessible only through contrast, through the recognition that something once made it possible for the ocean to remain uneventful for a very long time. That something does not need a name. It needed time. And time, once fragmented, does not return to the shapes it once allowed. The fragmentation of time continues to shape every inference drawn afterward, because when time no longer accumulates, meaning no longer settles, the modern ocean is rich in moments and poor in spans. It produces endless instances of cause and effect, but few conditions that persist long enough to become invisible. Everything now announces itself through motion. Even calm must be explained as temporary, provisional, waiting to be broken. This expectation of interruption has become so deeply embedded that it is mistaken for a law rather than a habit. The unclassifiable creature belonged to a world that had not yet learned this habit. In that world, continuity was assumed rather than questioned. Processes were allowed to finish because nothing forced them to hurry. Alignment had time to mature into sufficiency. Once mature, it held without reinforcement. The creature did not need to act because its existence was already the action required. It was the slow answer to a slow question, and as long as the question remained unchanged, the answer remained valid. When the question changed, the answer did not resist. Resistance would have required identity, boundaries, and reaction. The creature possessed none of these in a meaningful sense. It was not a self defending itself against the world. It was a configuration of the world defending itself against excess. When excess no longer arrived in the same form, the configuration dissolved. Dissolution is not failure. It is compliance with changed constraint. Life complied instantly, because life always does. The compliance did not register as loss, because nothing dramatic accompanied it. The ocean simply began behaving differently, slightly faster, slightly louder, slightly less forgiving. Those differences accumulated until they defined a new normal. Normality is powerful. Once established, it rewrites memory. The past is reinterpreted through its lens, and anything that does not fit is flattened into anomaly or ignored entirely. The unclassifiable creature survived this flattening only because its effects were too large to erase completely. They persist as statistical irregularities, as intervals that refuse to conform fully to modern expectations. These irregularities do not shout. They whisper. They require patience to hear. Patience is no longer a favored trait. The modern ocean rewards immediacy. The modern observer mirrors this reward structure. Attention moves quickly. Interpretation favors sharp signals. Long, uneventful durations are compressed or skipped. This compression makes the ancient calm feel empty. when in fact it was densely occupied by regulation operating below the threshold of event. The creature's role in that regulation cannot be overstated, but it also cannot be isolated. Isolation implies separability. The creature was inseparable from the conditions that sustained it. Its presence and the ocean's behavior were two expressions of the same state. To ask where the creature ended and the environment began is to apply a distinction that did not yet exist. That distinction emerged later, alongside fragmentation. As systems became modular, entities became countable. Boundaries hardened because they were necessary for survival. Individuality became functional. From that point onward, life could be cataloged, classified, and compared. The tools of modern biology emerged naturally from these conditions. They are powerful precisely because they are aligned with the world they describe. They are also limited by that alignment. They struggle with anything that does not present itself as a unit, an actor, a competitor. The unclassifiable creature fails to appear under such scrutiny because it never was any of those things. It was a field of influence sustained by duration rather than by action. Fields are not collected, they are experienced. When the experience ends, nothing can be retrieved except memory, and memory at planetary scale is indistinct. The ocean does not remember in stories. It remembers in behavior. The change in behavior is the only record that remains. That record tells a simple story, once it is read correctly. It says that life once solved the problem of excess by becoming slow enough to absorb it. It says that this solution worked until excess changed character. It says that when it stopped working, life abandoned it entirely and moved on to faster, louder strategies. It says that nothing was lost in the sense of damage, but something was lost in the sense of possibility. Possibility narrows and widens continuously. The ancient ocean allowed a possibility that the modern one does not. The modern ocean allows possibilities that the ancient one did not. Neither state is superior. They are answers to different constraints. The unclassifiable creature was an answer that fit once and does not fit now. The difficulty in accepting this answer lies not in evidence, but in expectation. There is a desire for persistence, for continuity of form, for survivors. This desire reflects a worldview shaped by lineage and inheritance. The creature does not satisfy that worldview because it did not reproduce itself. It reproduced a condition. When the condition vanished, there was nothing to inherit. This is the final challenge the story presents. It asks for acceptance of a form of life whose success is measured not by descendants, but by duration of effect. It asks for recognition that some solutions leave no legacy except a changed baseline. It asks for comfort with the idea that the most effective forms of life may erase themselves so completely that they can only be inferred after they are gone. The ocean today operates without that inference. It has no need for it. It is busy, expressive, and adaptive. It survives through constant motion. It does not miss the weight that once slowed it, because it has learned to live without it. Only reflection introduces the contrast. Only distance reveals that the earlier silence was not emptiness, but fullness held so evenly that it vanished into normality. The unclassifiable creature was the embodiment of that fullness. It did not need to be known to matter. It mattered because it worked, and when it no longer worked, it left without trace, without struggle, without demand for remembrance. The ocean accepted the change and continued, carrying life into a state where everything must be seen to survive. That is not a loss. It is a transition. And transitions, once complete, do not look back. The transition, once fully realized, reshaped not only the ocean's behavior, but the very scale at which meaning could be assigned. In the ancient regime, meaning accumulated slowly, distributed across vast spans of time, where continuity itself was informative. In the modern regime, meaning concentrates. It attaches to moments, to inflection points, to deviations that rise above background noise. The ocean learned to speak in peaks rather than plateaus, and interpretation followed. This shift quietly altered what could be valued. Duration lost prominence, intensity gained it. A process that persisted unchanged for millions of years no longer felt remarkable. A process that spiked briefly and collapsed dramatically commanded attention. The unclassifiable creature belonged entirely to the former category. Its persistence was its signal, but that signal could only be read in a world patient enough to notice sameness. Sameness is difficult to hold in focus. The mind drifts when nothing changes. Attention seeks contrast. In the absence of contrast, interpretation relaxes. This relaxation mirrors the state the ancient ocean itself had reached. The system did not demand vigilance because it had been buffered into adequacy. Life could afford to be inattentive at scale because nothing required urgent response. When urgency returned, attention sharpened. Systems began to track themselves. Feedback loops tightened. Life became self-monitoring in ways it had not been before. This self-monitoring is evident in modern complexity. It is a hallmark of adaptive systems operating near thresholds. It also ensures that nothing can disappear entirely into function again. Anything that ceases to signal is rapidly outcompeted by what does. The ancient creature did not compete because competition was unnecessary. Its environment was not saturated with rivals exploiting every gradient. Excess existed, but it was diffuse and predictable. The creature absorbed that excess not through consumption alone, but through persistence. It existed long enough to matter continuously, smoothing fluctuations by being there rather than by acting upon them. Once fluctuations became less predictable, persistence lost its advantage. The cost of maintaining coherence rose. The benefit declined. The balance tipped, and with it, the logic that had sustained the creature evaporated. This evaporation was not abrupt. It was gradual enough to evade notice. Only when the consequences accumulated did the difference become undeniable. That difference is now embedded so deeply in how the ocean behaves that imagining its absence requires deliberate effort. The modern sea feels naturally dynamic, as though it has always been so. Yet this feeling is a product of adaptation, not inevitability. The ocean learned to be dynamic because it had to. Before that necessity, it learned to be still. Stillness, in this context, does not imply inactivity. It implies equilibrium maintained without strain. The unclassifiable creature was a mechanism of that equilibrium, but mechanism may be too narrow a word. It was a state into which biology had settled, a state where scale and duration converged to suppress extremes before they could define the system. The modern ocean suppresses extremes differently. It allows them to occur, then recovers. This recovery is impressive, but it leaves scars. Each disturbance slightly alters the system's future responses. Over time, these alterations accumulate into complexity that is rich but brittle. The ancient ocean accumulated little because disturbances were dissipated before they could imprint. Imprint is the difference. The unclassifiable creature prevented imprint by spreading change thinly across time. When it vanished, imprinting began. The ocean acquired memory in the form of altered trajectories. Life began to evolve in response to recent history rather than deep continuity. This shortened memory horizon defines modern ecosystems. A shortened memory horizon favors adaptability over endurance. It rewards those who can respond quickly rather than those who can persist quietly. It fills the world with actors and diminishes the space for conditions. The creature was a condition, not an actor. Conditions cannot compete with actors in a world that rewards visibility. Visibility, however, is not the same as influence. The creature influenced everything precisely because it did not compete for attention. It operated beneath competition, beneath selection pressures that favored distinction. Its influence was infrastructural. shaping the stage rather than performing upon it. When that stage collapsed into motion, performers took over. The ocean became a theater of interaction. Life learned to exist as event rather than as background. This change produced the richness of modern biology, but it also erased the possibility of disappearing into adequacy. Adequacy is no longer enough. Survival now requires surplus of response, surplus of speed, surplus of innovation. These surpluses are costly. They require constant energy, constant turnover, constant risk. The modern ocean pays these costs willingly because it has no alternative. The ancient ocean did not need to. This contrast does not invite nostalgia. It invites comprehension. It shows that life's strategies are not progressive in a linear sense. They are situational. What works in one configuration fails in another. The unclassifiable creature was not outcompeted by something better. It was rendered unnecessary by a change in what the system required. Once rendered unnecessary, it did not linger. There was no residual population struggling on the margins. There were no degenerate forms carrying fragments of its logic. Its logic depended on completeness. Without completeness, it could not exist at all. This all-or-nothing quality is why it vanished so thoroughly. Thorough disappearance feels unsettling because it contradicts the expectation that everything leaves a trace. Yet many processes leave no trace once they end. A current shifts, and its previous path is forgotten. A climate stabilizes, and the forces that held it there become irrelevant. The creature belonged to this class of phenomena. It was a living process whose end erased its own necessity. The ocean absorbed that erasure and continued. Life adapted. Complexity blossomed. Noise became the medium of survival. The past receded into a silence that can only be reconstructed indirectly through anomalies that hint at a time when nothing dramatic needed to happen for the world to remain whole. That reconstruction is fragile because it relies on restraint rather than evidence. It requires trusting coherence over spectacle. It requires accepting that some of the most consequential chapters of life's history were written in a register so quiet that only their conclusion could ever be noticed. The underwater creature, too strange to be classified, belongs entirely to that register. Its story cannot be finished because it never began as an event. It can only fade, as it already has, into the conditions that replaced it. And in that fading, the ocean learned to live differently. That difference endures. The endurance of that difference becomes clearer the longer one remains with it, because it does not manifest as a single transformation, but as a cumulative reorientation of how life relates to uncertainty. In the ancient ocean, uncertainty was diluted by scale. Variations occurred, but they were absorbed into averages so broad that they lost urgency. The system did not need to predict the future precisely because the future resembled the past closely enough to remain manageable. The unclassifiable creature existed comfortably within that assumption. Its persistence depended on predictability, stretched across time, not on precision in response. As predictability eroded, uncertainty condensed. It arrived not as a diffuse background, but as discrete challenges that demanded resolution. Life reorganized itself to meet those challenges directly. Strategies became sharper, shorter-lived, more contingent. This shift did not eliminate stability, but it redefined it. Stability became something achieved temporarily through balance of forces rather than something sustained passively through integration. The ocean learned to stabilize itself repeatedly instead of remaining stable by default. This repeated stabilization produced a rhythm of tension and release that now defines marine systems. Productivity rises, collapses, and rises again. Populations surge, crash, and rebound. These cycles are not failures. They are adaptations to a world where long-term averaging is no longer reliable. Yet they also mark the loss of a mode of existence in which such cycles were unnecessary. The unclassifiable creature had lived in that earlier mode, where cycles were flattened before they could assert themselves. Flattening cycles does not eliminate life's dynamism. It redistributes it. The ancient ocean was dynamic at scales so large that individual fluctuations disappeared into continuity. That continuity allowed life to invest deeply in presence rather than in contingency. The creature embodied that investment. It did not hedge against disruption. It assumed alignment and was rewarded for as long as alignment held. Once alignment weakened, hedging became essential. Life diversified strategies not because diversity was inherently advantageous, but because no single strategy could be relied upon long enough to dominate. This diversification created redundancy, and redundancy created resilience. The modern ocean is resilient in this distributed way. It survives through overlap and replacement rather than through coherence. Coherence is fragile in a variable world. It requires trust in persistence. That trust has been broken too many times to be restored. The ocean now operates as though disruption is inevitable, and life reflects that assumption at every level. Nothing waits long enough to become invisible. Everything prepares to be replaced. Replacement is now fundamental. Species turnover is rapid. Ecosystems reassemble constantly. The record fills with transitions. This abundance of transition makes it difficult to imagine a time when replacement was unnecessary, when life did not need to prepare constantly for its own disappearance. The unclassifiable creature belonged to such a time. It existed without contingency plans, because contingency was rare. This absence of contingency is perhaps the most alien aspect of its existence. Modern intuition treats preparedness as synonymous with survival. To exist without preparing for disruption feels reckless. Yet, in a sufficiently buffered system, preparedness becomes wasteful. Energy spent on defense, speed, or diversification yields little return when conditions remain stable. In such a system, the most economical strategy is simply to remain. Remaining requires patience rather than alertness. It requires tolerance for sameness rather than hunger for opportunity. The unclassifiable creature was patient in a way modern life can no longer afford to be. Its patience was not chosen, it was enabled. The ocean made patience viable by suppressing the forces that would punish it. When those forces strengthened, patience became liability. The creature did not adapt its temperament. Temperament was its strategy. Without the environment that supported it, temperament could not be revised. Life abandoned that strategy entirely and moved toward one better suited to constant change. This abandonment was not gradual in the way evolution is often imagined. It was abrupt in functional terms, even if slow in temporal ones. Once the threshold was crossed where coherence could no longer be sustained cheaply, the strategy collapsed wholesale. There were no partial survivals, no scaled-down versions. The logic did not scale. It either held completely or not at all. This all-or-nothing quality explains why the creature's story feels so complete and so empty at the same time. Complete because nothing is missing. Empty because nothing remains. The creature left no unresolved threads because it did not fragment. It simply ceased to assemble. What followed assembled rapidly. Life rushed into the expanded space created by the loss of deep regulation. New forms, new interactions, new instabilities emerged. The ocean became a place where adaptation was visible and constant. This visibility defines modern understanding. It gives the impression that life is always doing something important. The ancient ocean was doing something equally important by preventing anything urgent from needing to happen. Preventing urgency does not produce spectacle. It produces continuity. Continuity fades from attention because it lacks contrast. Only when continuity breaks does it become visible in hindsight. The unclassifiable creature is visible only in that way, as a former condition inferred from what replaced it. The narrative, therefore, cannot advance toward a resolution, because the resolution already occurred in silence. The creature did not meet an end. It fulfilled a role until the role dissolved. The ocean did not register this as a loss. It registered it as a change in behavior. Life adapted accordingly. What remains is not a mystery demanding pursuit, but a perspective demanding patience. A willingness to accept that some of the most consequential forms of life are those that never needed to announce themselves, and that their disappearance reshapes the world not through catastrophe, but through acceleration. Acceleration is now the ocean's language. It speaks in cycles, surges, migrations, and collapses. These signals are loud enough to dominate attention. Beneath them lies the quiet recognition that once life spoke in averages instead, and the ocean listened. That conversation is over. The ocean has moved into a different mode of being. And the underwater creature too strange to be classified remains not as an unresolved question, but as an answer that no longer applies, remembered only through the difference it left behind. The difference left behind does not diminish with repetition. It clarifies. Each return to it strips away the expectation that something more concrete must eventually appear. No skeleton waits beneath sediment. No lineage threads forward into the present. What persists is only the altered behavior of a system that once operated under a different assumption about time, stability, and necessity. Necessity is the hinge on which everything turns. The unclassifiable creature existed because it was necessary in a way that is difficult to recognize from within a world where necessity has changed. It was not necessary because it prevented catastrophe in obvious ways. It was necessary because it allowed the ocean to remain indifferent to its own abundance. Indifference, in this sense, is not neglect. It is freedom from urgency. Urgency now governs everything. Nutrients arrive unevenly. Heat redistributes unpredictably. Circulation shifts on scales short enough to matter within lifetimes. Under such conditions, indifference is impossible. Every fluctuation must be answered. Life becomes vigilant, not by choice, but by obligation. The modern ocean is an environment that demands participation. Participation produces identity. To participate, an organism must distinguish itself, react, compete, adapt. Identity hardens around these requirements. Boundaries become essential. Memory shortens. Strategies prioritize speed over continuity. These traits dominate the present because they are the only ones that work now. The unclassifiable creature had no identity in this sense. It did not need one. Its persistence depended not on distinguishing itself from the environment, but on merging with it so completely that distinction lost meaning. That mode of existence is incompatible with a world structured around constant negotiation. Negotiation is the modern ocean's defining feature. Every gradient is contested. Every resource pulse triggers response. Nothing remains unused for long. This saturation creates the impression of fullness, but it is a fullness of motion, not of rest. The ancient ocean's fullness was of a different kind. It was full because it was held, not because it was busy. Holding requires trust. Trust that conditions will not change too rapidly. Trust that investment in presence will not be punished by sudden disruption. That trust once existed at planetary scale. The unclassifiable creature was built upon it. When trust eroded, the foundation of that mode collapsed. Collapse, however, implies failure. This was not failure. It was withdrawal of permission. Life was no longer permitted to remain still. The ocean did not forbid integration explicitly. It simply made it too expensive. Energy budgets shifted. Variability increased. Coherence became fragile. Under these conditions, any attempt at deep integration was dismantled before completion. This dismantling was not targeted. It did not single out the creature. It applied uniformly to all strategies that depended on long-term averaging. Life responded by abandoning those strategies entirely. The response was swift in evolutionary terms because alternatives already existed. Fragmentation, diversification, speed, these modes had always been available. They simply had not been optimal before. Optimality is contextual. The unclassifiable creature was optimal once, it is suboptimal now. That is the full extent of the explanation. There is no hidden drama, no lingering anomaly. The story resists conclusion because it resists spectacle. Spectacle is the currency of memory. What is dramatic is remembered. What is effective is forgotten. The creature's effectiveness ensured that it would not be memorialized in the usual ways. It did not shape the ocean through crises that could be marked and dated. It shaped it through restraint that erased the need for marks. Only when restraint ended did marking begin. The modern record is dense because restraint is gone. Every change leaves a trace. Every adaptation leaves a fossilizable difference. The abundance of evidence now makes the absence of evidence then feel suspicious. Yet absence was the point. The creature worked by preventing accumulation of difference. Difference drives evolution, but it also drives instability. The ancient ocean traded evolutionary speed for systemic calm. The modern ocean trades calm for adaptability. Both trades are rational responses to their environments. Neither is permanent. This recognition shifts the narrative away from wonder and toward acceptance. The underwater creature too strange to be classified does not demand belief as an article of faith. It demands only coherence as an explanation. If the ancient ocean behaved as it appears to have behaved, then something must have mediated that behavior. The creature is not an embellishment. It is a structural inference. Structural inferences do not produce satisfying images. They produce frameworks. They explain why something did not happen when it otherwise should have. They account for restraint without invoking improbability. The unclassifiable creature accounts for restraint by embodying it. When restraint ended, explanation shifted. The ocean's behavior no longer required such mediation. It could be explained through interaction, feedback, and rapid response. Modern science excels at these explanations because they match the world as it is now. The past required a different explanation because it was a different world. This is the final orientation the story offers. Not a creature to be found, but a way of understanding how life and environment co-evolve not only in form, but in tempo. How tempo determines which strategies are viable. How changes in tempo can erase entire modes of existence without leaving remains. The unclassifiable creature was erased in this way. It did not lose a battle. It lost its tempo. The ocean accelerated. Life followed, and the memory of what once held everything steady survives only as a quiet recognition that steadiness itself was once a biological achievement, not a given. Beyond that recognition, there is nothing to pursue. The story does not need an ending. It has already dissolved into the conditions that replaced it. The story can end only where it has been moving all along, not toward revelation, but toward stillness. What existed beneath the ancient ocean was not a creature in the way creatures are usually understood. It was a solution, a biological state that answered a question the planet once asked for a very long time: how to remain abundant without becoming unstable, how to persist without escalating, how to allow life to continue without forcing it to constantly react to itself. That question is no longer being asked. The ocean changed its tempo. Variability increased. Alignment dissolved. Time fragmented into usable moments instead of accumulating into eras. Under those conditions, the solution ceased to appear, not because it failed, but because it no longer fit. Life did what life always does when fit disappears. It let go completely and moved on. Nothing dramatic marked the transition. No extinction layer announced it. No boundary preserved its memory. The world simply became louder, faster, more expressive. Motion replaced weight. Reaction replaced presence. Noise replaced silence. The modern ocean feels alive because it must constantly prove that it is. The ancient ocean did not need to. It was held. The underwater creature, too strange to be classified, belonged entirely to that held world. It did not survive into the present because survival was never its function. Its function was fulfillment. And once fulfilled, it left no trace that demanded remembrance. What remains is not mystery, not loss, and not warning. What remains is perspective. The understanding that some forms of life are so complete that they erase themselves into normality, that some of the greatest influences do not appear as actors, but as conditions. That stability itself can be biological, temporary, and absolute while it lasts. The ocean no longer permits that form of life. It no longer needs it. And so the story ends, not with disappearance, but with acceptance, that the most effective solutions do not linger, the quietest chapters do not announce themselves, and the deepest silences are often the result of life working perfectly for as long as the world allows it to. Nothing more needs to be said.
We upload new videos every single day, so make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss what's next. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, it really helps the channel grow. Tell us in the comments what you'd like to see next. Your ideas might be in our next upload. Thank you so much for watching and for being part of our community. Stay tuned, stay curious, and we'll see you in the next video.